Hey there, tonight we're stepping once again into the quiet world of ancient Greece, a place of marbled temples and whispering olive groves, of gods who meddled in mortal lives, and of prophecies that seemed impossible to escape. It is a land where the sea carried both traitors and tragedies, and where heroes were said to walk just a step away from the divine. Tonight, we turn to the story of Theseus, a hero who would one day slay the Minotaur, become king of Athens, and leave behind a legacy tangled with both triumph and sorrow. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it truly brings you peace. And if you like, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There is something strangely comforting in seeing that others, scattered across the world, are falling asleep to the same story. So, dim the lights, let the calm settle in, close your eyes, and let us begin with the tale of Theseus. Our story begins not with Theseus himself, but with his father, Aegean, king of Athens, a man whose name, if you think of it, is tied forever to the sea itself, the Aegean Sea, said to be named for him. But at this point in the story, Aegean was not yet the tragic figure he would become. He was a man plagued by a simpler, more human problem. He had no heir in ancient Greece. A king without a son was like a house without a foundation. Without a clear successor, rivalries could break out. Cousins might rise against cousins, and the fragile web of loyalty that held a city together could easily unravel. Aegean had tried more than once to secure a child, but fate seemed to deny him again and again. His wives gave him no sons, and he grew older with each passing year. Watching his city grow restless, like so many Greeks in times of uncertainty, he turned to the oracle at Delphi. The Pythia, seated upon her tripod above the rising vapors of Apollo's sacred spring, was the voice of the god, but her words were rarely straightforward. When Aegean asked her how he might secure an heir, the oracle gave him one of those riddling responses that seem clear only after the fact. She told him not to loosen the mouth of the wineskin until he returned to Athens. Now, to you and me, that sounds puzzling. A wineskin is a simple enough object, a container for wine made of leather, tied shut at the top. But what did it mean to not loosen its mouth? Aegean left Delphi no wiser than when he had arrived. Prophecies often worked that way. They were more like riddles than answers, and the real meaning became clear only once events had already unfolded, confused and troubled. Aegean stopped on his way back at the city of Troezen, a quiet place on the Peloponnesian coast across the waters from Athens. Here ruled King Perilous, a man famed for his wisdom. Perhaps, Aegean thought, Perilous could help him untangle the words of Apollo. Perilous, it seems, understood the oracle's meaning, or at least believed he did. The prophecy, he decided, was a warning about conception, that Aegean was not to father a child in haste or with the wrong woman. But like many wise men in myth, Perilous had ambitions of his own. He saw in Aegean not just a troubled man, but an opportunity. If Aegean needed an heir, why should that heir not come from Perilous' own line? And so Perilous set about arranging matters in a way that would benefit both families, or at least his own. He had a daughter named Aethra, whose name means bright sky or clear air. Aethra was beautiful, yes, as heroines in Greek myth often are. But more importantly, she was dutiful and obedient to her father. Pittheus, knowing Aegeus was weary from travel, invited him to stay the night. And that evening, whether by design or by the subtle persuasion of wine, Aegeus lay with Aethra. The details vary in different tellings, as Greek myths often do. Some say that on that same night, Aethra dreamed a dream, or was visited by the sea god, Poseidon himself, who also claimed her. In this version, Theseus was born of both a mortal king and a god, giving him that curious double heritage so common among heroes, mortal, yet touched by the divine. Whichever version you prefer, what is certain is that Aethra conceived a child that night. Aegeus, however, was cautious. He knew how quickly fortunes could change, and how dangerous rival claimants to his throne might become. He did not yet want the world to know of this union. Before leaving Troezen, he placed a heavy stone upon the ground, and beneath it he hid a sword and a pair of sandals. These, he told Aethra, were to be for their child, should it be a son. When the boy was old enough, if he had the strength to lift the stone and claim what lay beneath, then he would be worthy to come to Athens and claim his birthright. It is an image worth pausing over. A great, flat rock, heavy and unmoving, and beneath it the tokens of kingship. A sword, symbol of power and of defense, and sandals, symbol of a journey yet to come. The boy, when he grew, would have to prove his strength, not just with muscles, but with determination, to uncover what was already his. Myths often delight in these little tests, these symbolic acts that reveal character. It is not enough to be born of a king. One must show oneself ready to walk the path of a hero. And so Aegeus returned to Athens, leaving Aethra behind in Troezen to raise their child quietly, away from the watchful eyes of rival nobles. Theseus grew up not knowing his father, surrounded instead by the sea breezes of Troezen, the templed hills, and the quiet guidance of his mother. But for now, let us linger a moment on that beginning. A king desperate for an heir, a prophecy spoken in riddles, a wise man who twisted it to his advantage, and a woman caught between the plans of men and the designs of gods. Theseus had not yet drawn his first breath, yet already the threads of fate were knotted tightly around him. Prophecy, ambition, secrecy, and perhaps divine intervention. These would be the forces that shaped his earliest days, as Aethra carried him beneath her heart. She must have wondered what kind of life awaited him. Would he live quietly, known only as her son? Or would he someday lift the stone and set out toward a destiny greater than any imagined? Such questions, of course, were not hers alone. They are the questions whispered at the start of many myths, and like so many others, Theseus's story was only beginning. In the hush of Troezen, beneath the shadow of a hidden sword and a pair of waiting sandals. The people of Troezen, of course, could not help but notice the changes in Aethra. In small towns, little remained hidden for long. But whether by respect for Pittheus, or by the discretion of neighbors who understood the delicate balance of royal affairs, her pregnancy was not made into gossip. It was a quiet matter, spoken of only in whispers, and even then with care. The old king's daughter bore a child, yes, but the identity of the father was left vague, a mystery wrapped in silence. When the boy was born, he was given the name Theseus. Names in Greek tradition often carried meanings, and his was no different. It comes from the word thesis, meaning to set in place or foundation. Some say the name was chosen because he would be the foundation of Athens's greatness, the one who brought its people together into a single city. Others suggest it was simply a name of strength, a name that promised steadiness. Whatever the reason, the name settled over him like a quiet prophecy of its own in those earliest years. Theseus was like any other child. He played, he laughed, he learned to walk on the polished stone floors of Troezen's palace. Yet Aethra never forgot the weight of the stone outside, nor the treasures hidden beneath it. Every time she walked past, she must have thought of the day her son would be old enough to try his strength against it. Perhaps she placed her hand upon the stone when no one was watching, feeling its solidity, imagining the moment it would finally move. The sandals and the sword waited patiently in their hiding place, silent witnesses to his growing strength. Meanwhile, in Athens, Aegean continued his life as king. To his people, he remained a ruler without an heir. He had left Troezen with no public announcement, no declaration of fatherhood. His rivals whispered that he was weak, that he would leave Athens vulnerable when he passed. In the shadows, men sharpened their ambitions like blades, waiting for their moment. Aegean must have felt the pressure mounting year by year, but he said nothing of Aethra, nothing of the child. Secrecy was his protection. For if the boy were known too soon, assassins might strike, and the fragile hope of an heir would vanish before it could take root back in Troezen. Theseus's childhood unfolded in the rhythm of the seasons. The sea winds carried the scent of salt into the courtyards. Olive trees bent in the summer sun. Festivals brought music and dancing, and the boy grew up among stories of gods and heroes. Old men told tales of Heracles, that mighty figure who had roamed Greece performing his labors. Children laughed at stories of Hermes, the trickster messenger, and in quiet moments, Theseus heard whispers of Poseidon, god of the sea, whose power rolled endlessly beyond the horizon. Perhaps his mother told him, when he asked about his father, that he had a protector in the waves, a god who watched from afar. Whether she believed it or not, the story must have comforted him. And so he grew, strong in limb, bright in mind. Even as a child, he showed signs of courage. He was said to have an eagerness to test himself, to run farther, climb higher, wrestle harder than the other boys. There was an energy about him, not the wildness of a reckless youth, but the restless determination of someone who sensed, though he could not yet name it, that his life held a larger purpose. All the while, the stone remained patient and unmoved. Its weight was like the weight of destiny itself. No one spoke of it directly, but its presence hung over Aethra's household like a shadow. For one day, when the boy was ready, the stone would be more than stone. It would be a gate, a threshold, a test of worthiness. Some storytellers add another layer here. They say that on the night Theseus was conceived, Aethra had a dream in which Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, appeared to her. In the dream, Athena told her to cross the narrow strait to the island of Spheria, a small place just off the coast of Troezen. There, under the starlight, Aethra poured a libation to the gods and lay down upon the earth. And there Poseidon came to her. In this version, Theseus was doubly blessedor, doubly burdened with two fathers, one mortal, one divine. It is a story that emphasizes his special nature, that he was not just another royal child, but one destined to bridge the worlds of men and gods. Whichever version is true, the outcome is the same. A child born of secrecy and of mingled bloodlines. A boy who would grow into the man remembered across centuries. But for now, we linger in the quiet years of his youth. Picture him at the edge of the sea, skipping stones across the waves. Imagine him at festivals, dancing in the torchlight, his laughter carrying into the night air. He was not yet the slayer of monsters, not yet the founder of cities. He was simply a boy, unaware that his name would echo through history. And perhaps that is the gentlest image to hold as you drift deeper into calm. A child running along the shore, the sea breeze in his hair, while the gods above smile at the unfolding of destiny. In time, he would learn of the stone. In time, he would be tested. But for now, let the story rest in its cradle, with Theseus still young, the weight of the future hidden beneath the earth, waiting for the moment when strength and courage would lift it free. Theseus's childhood in Troezen unfolded quietly, but with each passing year, small signs began to show that this was no ordinary boy. In the soft air of the coastal city, with the Saronic Gulf stretching endlessly to the horizon, he grew beneath the watchful eyes of his mother Aethra and his grandfather Pythois. Troezen was not a place of great armies or sprawling power, but a modest city nestled among gentle hills, rich with myths of its own. For a boy destined for greatness, it was a peaceful cradle, a place where strength could grow slowly, like an oak tree rooting itself in the earth before stretching toward the sky. The people of Troezen whispered about the boy. They could not help it. Children always attract notice, but this child seemed touched by something beyond the ordinary. He was quick to learn, strong for his age, and bold in ways that made older men nod in approval. When other children played with wooden toys, Theseus asked about stories of gods and heroes. When other boys tired of running, Theseus pressed on, his determination carrying him farther along the shoreline until his small legs could carry him no more. Pythois, wise and shrewd as he was, saw these traits and encouraged them. The old king had a reputation across Greece for his knowledge of words and riddles. He had once been counted among the wisest men, and he had not forgotten the art of shaping young minds. Perhaps he saw in Theseus not only his grandson, but also the potential to leave behind a legacy through him. Where Aethra nurtured her son with quiet love, Pythois sharpened him with lessons. Greek boys of noble birth were expected to train not only their bodies, but their minds. And so Theseus learned both. In the mornings, he was taught letters, how to scratch the marks of the alphabet onto wax tablets, how to recite poetry from memory, how to listen to the rhythm of Homeric verse even before he understood every word. In the afternoons, he ran with the other boys, wrestled in the gymnasium, and practiced with the spear and the javelin. The Greeks believed that a balanced life of body and mind created the ideal man, and Theseus grew in both. The gymnasium, in those days, was not just a place for exercise, but also for friendship and conversation. It was a place where boys were molded into citizens. Theseus, even as a youth, showed leadership. The other children often followed his lead, whether in games or in contests. He was not a tyrant about Aethra. His confidence made others trust him, and when disputes arose, he had a knack for settling them fairly, something rare in one so young. Yet, for all his promise, there was also an emptiness that lingered in his heart. The question of his father. Children notice what is missing. Theseus saw other boys led home by fathers, men who offered guidance, discipline, and pride. He had only his mother, and though she gave him love, she could not answer the questions that grew sharper with each year. Who was his father? Why was his name never spoken? Why did Pythois, who loved to explain riddles, fall silent when asked about the man who had given him life? Some say Aethra told him that his father was Poseidon, the god of the sea, and perhaps Theseus believed it. Children are quick to accept wonder, to imagine that the rolling waves and the salt wind carried a divine father's presence must have been both comforting and awe-inspiring. Yet the silence around his mortal father remained heavy, a silence more telling than words. Theseus learned, even as a boy, that not all answers are given when we ask. Some are hidden until the right moment, and so he filled the gap with his own efforts. He grew determined to prove himself, even without a father's name. When he wrestled, he pushed harder. When he ran, he strained to be first. When he listened to tales of heroes, Heracles, Perseus, Jason, he measured himself against them, imagining that one day he too would be counted among their number. A seed of ambition grew quietly in his heart, watered by uncertainty and by longing for recognition. The city of Troezen itself shaped him as much as his family did. It was a place steeped in myth. The people pointed to the nearby island of Calaria and spoke of Demeter's temples. They told tales of Hippolytus, the tragic son of Theseus, who would one day be worshipped there, though that story still lay far in the future. The land itself whispered with stories, and Theseus absorbed them all. He roamed the rocky hills, learning their contours. He swam in the waters of the gulf, his strokes carrying him farther than other boys dared to go. He learned how to climb cliffs, how to balance on stones, how to survive in the wilderness with little more than his own wits. Unbeknownst to him, these skills would one day serve him well on the long and dangerous road to Athens, when each mile would bring him face to face with bandits and beasts. But for now, they were only the games of a boy who loved to test himself against the world. There was, too, the constant presence of the stone. Imagine it, a massive slab resting just outside the palace grounds, unremarkable to anyone who did not know its secret. To Theseus, it must have seemed ordinary at first, just another rock in the landscape. But Aethra, in quiet moments, reminded him of its importance. Not yet, she would tell him. Not until you are strong enough. Beneath it lies your destiny. Beneath it lies what will show you who you truly are. It is not hard to imagine how such words would shape a boy's mind. Every day, he might pass by the stone and place his hand upon it, feeling the cool hardness beneath his fingers. Every day, he might wonder if today was the day he could lift it, and every day, until the time was right, he would find it immovable. That immovable weight became both a challenge and a promise. One day, it seemed to whisper, "One day you will know the truth." Meanwhile, Aegean in Athens continued to rule uneasily. He had left Troezen without telling a soul of his child, and so his court remained full of whispers and rivalries. The nobles of Athens eyed the throne, each waiting for the chance to claim it when Aegeus's strength faltered. Among them was Medea, the sorceress, who had fled from Corinth and made her way to Athens. Some versions say she was already at Aegeus's side, offering him counsel and dark enchantments. She, too, feared the appearance of a legitimate heir, and so fate, always circling, prepared obstacles even before Theseus had begun his journey. But in Troezen, life remained quiet. Theseus grew taller, broader of shoulder. He excelled in contests of speed and strength. In time, he matched, and then surpassed, boys older than himself. The admiration of his peers was one thing, but what mattered more was the quiet pride in his mother's eyes. Aethra, who had carried him in secrecy and raised him under the weight of unspoken destiny, began to see the outlines of the man he would become. The years passed, and Theseus approached manhood. The stone, always present, waited, and with each season, his curiosity about his father grew sharper. He pressed Aethra for answers, and at last, when she judged him old enough, she told him of the hidden tokens. She led him to the stone and explained that beneath it lay the sword and sandals left by his father, placed there as a test of his strength and his worthiness. Theseus looked at the stone with new eyes. It was no longer just a heavy rock, but a barrier standing between him and the truth of his identity. All his life, he had trained, struggled, and tested himself, and now the moment of proof had come. He set his hands to the stone, braced his body, and pushed. At first, it did not move. The weight of years held it firm. But Theseus did not give up. Again and again, he tried, muscles straining, breath heaving, until at last, with a surge of strength, the stone shifted. Dust rose from the ground, and the slab tipped aside. Beneath it lay the sandals and the sword, untouched by time, waiting as though they had known all along that this day would come. Theseus took them up, the sandals marking him as one ready for the road, the sword marking him as one ready for challenges ahead. And in that moment, he was no longer just the boy of Troezen. He was the son of a king, the heir of Athens, and a hero on the threshold of his destiny. Yet even then, his journey had only begun. The road to Athens stretched long before him, filled with perils that would test not only his strength, but also his courage and his wisdom. But that is a tale for the next part of our story. For now, let the image rest in your mind. A young man standing over a stone he has finally lifted, holding a sword that glimmers in the sunlight. His mother looking on with both pride and fear, knowing that her son has claimed his destiny and that nothing will ever be the same again. When Theseus lifted the great stone and drew forth the sword and sandals that had rested beneath it for so many years, a quiet transformation came over him. Until that moment, he had been a youth of Troezen, known for his boldness, his skill, and his restless spirit. But the weight of the sword in his hand carried with it the weight of destiny. It was not only a blade of bronze, but a sign that his life was now bound to Athens, the city of his father, King Aegean. With the sandals strapped to his feet, he felt the path opening before him, not as a dream, but as an inevitability. His mother, Aethra, looked upon him with mingled pride and fear. She had known this day would come, and she had long dreaded it. In her heart, she had cherished the quiet years in Troezen, years where her son was hers alone, untroubled by the dangers and intrigues of kingship. Now, with the sword at his side, she knew those years were over. She urged him to take the safer way, the sea route, 4 ships carried men swiftly to Athens, bypassing the perils of the land. For the journey by land was no gentle road. Greece in those days was not yet tamed. Bandits haunted the hills. Savage men preyed on travelers. Each narrow pass and each lonely stretch of forest hid threats that could end a man's life. Aethra begged him, with all the earnestness of a mother's love, to choose the ships. But Theseus, even in youth, was not a man to take the easy way. Perhaps it was pride. Perhaps it was the need to prove himself worthy of the sword he now carried. Perhaps it was the stirring of fate within him, urging him to follow the harder road, the road that would temper him into a true hero. Whatever the cause, Theseus shook his head. He would face the dangers, not avoid them. For what kind of son would he be if he arrived in Athens with no trials to show his worth? He would not come creeping into his father's halls like a boy seeking favor. He would come as a man who had faced the wilderness and conquered it. Theseus made his farewells in Troezen, and with the sword at his hip and the sandals on his feet, he set out upon the long road. The path stretched northward, winding through hills and valleys, over rivers and through dense forests. Each step carried him farther from the safety of his childhood and deeper into the shadowed land where danger lurked unseen. The first challenge came not far from Troezen, at a place where the road narrowed between cliffs. Here dwelt a man named Periphates, known to travelers as the club-bearer. He was a son of Hephaestus, it was said, and he carried with him a great club of iron, heavy enough to crush a man with a single blow. Periphates made his living by waylaying those who passed, beating them to death with his weapon, and stripping them of their belongings. When Theseus approached, the robber stepped forth from the shadows, the iron club resting on his shoulder. He was a huge man, scarred and grim, his eyes hard with cruelty. He laughed at the sight of the youth before him, for he saw only another victim, untested and alone. But Theseus did not shrink back. The fight was swift but fierce. Periphates, the sound of the iron striking stone rang through the pass. Again and again the robber swung, but Theseus pressed in close, forcing his enemy to tire. At last, with a sudden surge, Theseus wrenched the club from Periphates' hands and brought it down upon him, ending his life. And so the club-bearer fell by the very weapon with which he had slain so many others. From that day forward, Theseus carried the iron club as his own, a symbol of his strength and a warning to all who would challenge him. Travelers who later saw the youth with the weapon upon his shoulder whispered of the hero who had slain the club-bearer and turned the robbers' cruelty against him further along the road. In the region of Crommyon, Theseus encountered another peril. There, the countryside was terrorized, not by a man, but by a beast, a great wild sow, fierce and destructive, that ravaged fields and struck fear into the hearts of the villagers. The Crommyonian sow, they called it, and none had been able to bring it down. When Theseus heard of it, he did not pass by. He sought out the beast, tracking it through thickets and marshes until he came upon it, tusks gleaming, hide bristling. The fight was long, for the beast was cunning as well as strong. But Theseus prevailed in the end, slaying the sow and freeing the land from its terror. The villagers rejoiced, and word of his deed spread further, carried by shepherds and travelers. As he pressed onward, Theseus came to the narrow pass near the Isthmus of Corinth. a place of danger known to all. For there dwelt Sinis, the pine-bender, a man of monstrous cruelty. He would seize travelers and bind them to 2 pine trees, bent low by his strength, then release the trees, tearing his victims apart. Many had perished in this fashion, their cries echoing in the wild hills. Theseus met him without fear. The two fought fiercely, the air filled with the crashing of branches and the shouts of battle. At last, Theseus overpowered Sinis and bound him to his own pine trees, giving him the same death he had given to so many others. Justice, in the harsh logic of those times, was often the turning of a man's cruelty back upon himself, and so it was with Sinis. From there, the road led Theseus to the cliffs of Siren, where the path narrowed dangerously above the sea. Here, another robber lay in wait Siren, who forced travelers to wash his feet, only to kick them into the waves below, where a monstrous turtle waited to devour them. Many had been cast down to their deaths in this way. When Theseus came to him, Siren demanded the same service, but Theseus, wary, seized the robber instead. In the struggle that followed, it was Siren who was hurled from the cliff, falling into the sea below to meet the fate he had prepared for so many others. The waves closed over him, and the turtle devoured his body, leaving nothing but the memory of his cruelty. Still, Theseus pressed on, and at Eleusis he met Cercyon, a man who challenged all travelers to wrestle with him. Cercyon was strong, and he delighted in killing those who faced him. But Theseus, skilled in wrestling from his youth in Troezen, with patience and cunning, he turned Cercyon's own strength against him, lifting him and dashing him to the ground. Thus ended another terror of the road at last. Theseus came to the most terrible of them all, Procrustes, the stretcher, who dwelt on the road to Athens. This man welcomed travelers into his home, offering them food and rest. But his hospitality hid a dreadful cruelty, for he possessed a bed, and he forced each guest to fit it exactly. If the guest was too short, he stretched them until their limbs tore. If they were too tall, he cut away what hung over the edges. None ever left his house alive. Theseus entered the house of Procrustes, but he had learned from the dangers before. When the robber sought to bind him to the bed, Theseus turned on him with the same merciless justice he had shown the others. He laid Procrustes upon his own bed and made him fit it by the cruel methods he had inflicted on so many. Thus perished the stretcher, and the road was freed from his horror. By the time Theseus neared Athens, the land was safer than it had been in many years. One by one, he had rid the road of its terrors, slaying or punishing those who preyed on travelers. Word of his deeds spread quickly, carried by those who now traveled in safety. Already, before he even set foot in his father's city, Theseus was becoming known as a hero, a man who brought order where there had been chaos. Yet he himself thought little of fame. He was weary from the long road, but proud, for he had chosen the harder path and prevailed. Each battle had hardened him, not only in strength, but in spirit. He had proven to himself that he was not merely a youth with a sword given by fate, but a man who could earn his place among heroes. And so, as the city of Athens came into view, with its temples gleaming on the heights, Theseus felt the weight of destiny settling upon him once more. Ahead lay not only his father's recognition, but new dangers, for the court of Aegean was troubled by jealous rivals and by the presence of Medea, whose cunning and sorcery would soon seek to destroy him. But that is a tale for the next part of our story. For now, let the image rest in your mind, a young man striding toward Athens, his sword at his side, the club of Periphetes upon his shoulder, his heart steady and unafraid, having tamed the wilderness behind him, and ready to face whatever awaited in the city of kings. When at last Theseus came within sight of Athens, the city seemed to rise before him like a dream given shape in stone. The land around it was rocky, the hills jagged. But upon one of those heights gleamed the Acropolis, crowned with temples whose white marble caught the sunlight. Below, the streets wound in narrow paths, filled with the sounds of a thriving city. Merchants called out their wares in the agora. Potters worked at their wheels. The smell of baking bread drifted from hearths, and the laughter of children echoed in the alleys. For Theseus, who had known only the smaller town of Troezen and the wild country roads, Athens seemed vast and teeming, alive with 1,000 different voices. Yet he came not as a stranger. He came as the son of its king, though few yet knew it. The sword at his side and the sandals upon his feet were tokens of his heritage. But he carried no proclamation, no retinue, no heralds to announce his claim. He walked the streets as any traveler might, his cloak dusty from the long road, his iron club slung across his shoulder. The people glanced at him with curiosity, noting his bearing, his youth, and the weapon that marked him as more than ordinary. But still, they did not know him. In the palace of Aegean, matters were less tranquil than the city streets suggested. The king, though a figure of dignity, was weary with age and troubled by the uncertainties of succession. For many years he had longed for a son, fearing that his line might end without an heir. At last, the gods had granted him a child in Troezen, but that child had grown far away, hidden until the time was right, here in Athens. Aegean lived under the influence of another woman whose presence cast a shadow across the court. Medea, the sorceress, wife of Aegean, dwelt in the palace, and her will was strong. She had come to Athens after her flight from Corinth, and though her past was steeped in blood and betrayal, she held sway over the king with her cunning words and her knowledge of potions and prophecy. To the people, she was both feared and distrusted, a foreigner whose powers were whispered of in hushed tones. But to Aegean, she was a counselor, a companion, and in her own mind, she was mistress of the palace. When word reached her of a young man newly arrived in Athens, bearing himself with the confidence of a prince and carrying strange tokens of lineage, her heart stirred with unease. For she was quick to sense threats and quicker still to strike at them. She asked questions, listening to the murmurs of the market, the gossip of servants, the stories of travelers who had seen this stranger upon the road. And soon she discerned the truth, or enough of it to know that this youth was no ordinary wanderer. He was Theseus, son of Aegean, rightful heir to the throne she had thought to control. Jealousy and fear kindled in her, for if Theseus were acknowledged, her own power would fade, and her son-born of her union with Aegeus would have no claim to rule. She resolved, therefore, to destroy him before his identity could be revealed. Meanwhile, Theseus made his way through the city to the palace gates. The guards, seeing his fine bearing and the sword at his side, allowed him to pass within. He was brought before Aegeus, who sat upon his throne, a man of graying hair, his eyes sharp yet weary. Theseus bowed respectfully, yet with a dignity that showed he was no common petitioner. He did not at once declare his name or lineage, for he wished to be recognized not merely by blood, but by deeds. Instead, he spoke of his journey, of the robbers and monsters he had slain along the road, of the safety he had brought to the land between Troezen and Athens. The courtiers listened in amazement, for these were the very terrors that had haunted their travels, and they marveled that this youth had vanquished them all. But Medea, standing at Aegeus's side, listened with narrowed eyes. She saw the admiration growing in the king's face, the flicker of recognition that stirred as he looked upon the youth, and she knew she must act quickly. Whispering softly into Aegeus's ear, she sowed seeds of doubt. She told him that this young man was no true friend of Athens, but a rival, perhaps a foreign prince come to seize power by deception. She warned that his deeds, though great, were those of an ambitious man who might turn against the throne. Her words, laced with poison, found root in Aegeus's anxious heart. For though he was drawn to the stranger, he was also fearful. What if Medea was right? What if this youth was come to supplant him? Better to be cautious than to risk betrayal. And so, swayed by her counsel, he withheld his welcome and treated Theseus as any unknown guest. Yet the king, bound by the laws of hospitality, offered a feast in honor of his visitor. The tables were laid with meats and bread, with wine poured into gleaming cups, the air filled with the scent of roasted lamb and herbs, the murmurs of courtiers, the music of lyres. Theseus sat among them, calm and untroubled, unaware that danger was already gathering against him, for Medea, determined to rid herself of him, had devised a plan. In secret, she prepared a cup of wine laced with a deadly poison. With her skill in sorcery, she brewed a draught that would kill swiftly and silently, leaving no trace. When the moment came, she intended to place it in the hands of Aegeus himself, who, trusting her, would offer it to the youth. Thus, she thought, Theseus would perish before he could ever speak the truth of his birth. The feast continued, laughter rising, cups filled and emptied, the torches casting golden light upon the walls. At last, Medea brought forth the cup, the wine within glimmering darkly. She placed it in the hand of Aegeus, and with a gentle word, bade him offer it to their guest. The king, though still uncertain, raised the cup and extended it toward Theseus. In that moment, as fate would have it, the light of the torches caught upon the sword at Theseus's side. The bronze gleamed with a familiar shine, and Aegeus, glancing down, saw the weapon clearly for the first time. His heart leaped, for he knew it at once. It was the very sword he had placed beneath the stone so many years before, the token he had left for the son he might never see. And then, looking again at the youth before him, he saw in his face the likeness of his own features, the reflection of himself in younger form. With sudden clarity, the truth struck him. This was no stranger, no rival, no pretender. This was his son, his flesh and blood, Theseus, born of Aethra and destined to stand beside him. Aegeus's hand trembled, and he dashed the cup to the floor, the poisoned wine spilling harmlessly upon the ground. Rising from his seat, he drew Theseus into his arms, embracing him with tears of joy. The court looked on in astonishment as the king proclaimed before all that this youth was his son. the heir of Athens. The joy that filled the hall was great, but not all shared in it. Medea, seeing her plot undone and her power slipping from her grasp, knew she could no longer remain. Gathering her own son, she fled the palace that very night, vanishing into the shadows, never again to hold sway in Athens. Her name would linger only in whispers, a reminder of treachery narrowly averted. They marveled at his courage, at the tales of his journey, at the sword that bound him to the king. The city buzzed with excitement, for in him they saw the promise of renewal, the strength of youth joined with the wisdom of heritage. Yet for Theseus himself, the recognition was both a joy and a burden. He had found his father and been welcomed into his rightful place, but he also knew that the path before him would not be easy, for Athens was troubled by darker matters than Medea's plots. Beyond the walls of the city loomed the shadow of Crete and the dreadful tribute demanded by King Minos, the sending of young men and women to be devoured by the Minotaur in the labyrinth. Theseus had only just begun to taste the duties of his heritage, and already fate was preparing to draw him into the most perilous challenge of all. But for that night, the palace glowed with light and music. Father and son sat together, speaking long into the hours, telling of the years they had lost, of the hopes they now shared. The courtiers rejoiced, the people celebrated in the streets, and the name of Theseus spread swiftly through the city. In the quiet moments, perhaps Aegeus looked at his son and thought of the long years of doubt and loneliness that had weighed upon him. And Theseus, gazing upon his father, must have felt the strange wonder of destiny fulfilled. The path from Troezen to Athens, now complete. The sword, the sandals, the long road, the dangers conquered all, had led him here, to the embrace of his father and the recognition of his birthright. Thus ended the first chapter of Theseus's story in Athens, a tale of poison thwarted, of family restored, and of destiny revealed. Yet already the next chapter waited, darker and more demanding, for the threads of fate wove ceaselessly onward, drawing him toward the labyrinth and the beast within. Theseus had grown in strength, in wisdom, and in determination. The boy who once ran laughing along the shore had become a youth of broad shoulders and steady step, a young man whose gaze carried purpose. The stories of his early feats, the taming of horses, the wrestling of other boys his age, the long runs across the hills of Troezen were already the talk of the town. Yet within him he knew that he was meant for more than the games of youth. A greater task awaited, one hidden beneath the weight of stone. The day came when his mother judged him ready. Perhaps it was not marked by a particular event, but rather by the slow accumulation of strength, of maturity, of patience. Aethra had watched him closely through the years, noting not just the growth of his muscles, but also the temper of his spirit. For it was not mere strength that would lift the stone, it was resolve, steadiness, the understanding that he carried a destiny larger than himself. One morning, she led him quietly from the palace, away from the courtyards and the laughter of servants, away from the chatter of neighbors and the market stalls. They walked together through the groves, where the air smelled of olives and resin, until they reached the place where the stone lay half buried in the earth. The great slab had not shifted since the day Aegeus placed it there. Moss clung to its sides, roots pressed against it from below. To any passerby, it was nothing more than a stubborn rock, one of many scattered across the land. But Aethra knew. She had always known. And now her son would know too. Theseus, she said softly, her hand resting on his arm. Your strength has grown, but more than that, your heart has grown. You are ready to learn what has been kept from you. She gestured toward the stone. Long ago, before you were born, your father placed something beneath this rock. He said that when his son was grown, when he was strong enough and steady enough, he would be able to lift it. What lies beneath belongs to you. But more than that, Tit will reveal who you are meant to be. Theseus studied the stone, his brow furrowed. He had lifted heavy weights before, hauled logs, carried baskets of stone for the builders in Troezen, even wrestled animals into submission. But this was different. This was no simple test of strength, was a trial of destiny. He placed his hands against the rough surface, feeling its cold resistance. For a moment he only breathed, steady and calm, as though listening to the pulse of the earth itself. Then, with a deep breath, he pressed his weight forward, muscles straining, tendons tight. The stone did not budge. He shifted, crouching lower, setting his feet firmly into the soil, and pushed again. A low sound escaped his throat, more breath than voice. At first, the rock remained as still as ever, but then, faintly, there was movement. The earth trembled around its edges. Dust rose in small puffs. Theseus pressed harder, his back straightening with effort, and slowly, impossibly, the stone began to rise. It was not graceful, not easy. The veins in his arms stood out, sweat streaked his brow, his body shook with the strain. But bit by bit, he lifted the slab high enough to shove it aside. It rolled a short distance and settled into the soil with a thud, leaving a dark hollow in its place. Inside, carefully wrapped, were the tokens Aegeus had left, a pair of sandals and a sword. The sandals were simple but sturdy, fashioned of leather to withstand long journeys. The sword, by contrast, gleamed faintly even in the shadows. Its hilt was plain, not the kind adorned with jewels, but the blade was sharp, strong, unyielding. Aethra knelt and lifted the items, her hands trembling as she passed them to her son. These, she said, belonged to your father. He is King Aegeus of Athens. When he left me here, he told me that if a son were born, he should prove his strength by lifting this stone. You have done so. Now the time has come to claim your birthright. Theseus took the sandals and fastened them onto his feet. He held the sword in his hands, testing its balance, feeling its weight. Though it was the first time he had touched it, there was a familiarity to the blade, as though it had been waiting for him, as though it recognized him. He did not smile, nor did he boast. Instead, he was quiet, contemplative, aware of the gravity of the moment. Aethra continued, her voice low but firm. Athens is your home, though you have not seen it. Your father rules there, but his throne is uncertain, his enemies many. He does not yet know you live, but when you go to him, he will know you by these tokens. He will know you are his son. At those words, a decision formed in Theseus's mind. The path before him was clear. He would travel to Athens, not as a hidden child, not as a nameless youth, but as a rightful heir. The thought stirred his spirit, not with arrogance, but with a sense of duty. He was not going for glory. He was going because it was his place, his responsibility, his destiny. Yet destiny rarely unfolds in simple lines. The journey itself would test him. Already, word had spread of bandits along the roads, of men who preyed upon travelers, of monsters that haunted lonely stretches. Aethra, wise with a mother's foresight, urged him to take the sea route, where the journey would be safer, swifter. But Theseus, even then, was determined to prove himself. He chose the land route, knowing it would bring trials, knowing it would challenge him. For in his heart, he believed that only by facing dangers could he truly become the man Athens needed that night. As he rested with the sword by his side, the sandals at his feet, the weight of the decision pressed upon him. He lay awake, hearing the distant sound of waves against the shore, the rustle of leaves in the wind. Perhaps he wondered what kind of father awaited him in Athens. Would Aegeus embrace him? Would he believe? Or would suspicion and rivalry overshadow recognition? The questions lingered, but Theseus did not falter. He had chosen his path. The next morning, Troezen stirred with the news. Some whispered in awe that the young man had lifted the great stone, a feat none had attempted. Others spoke of the sword, gleaming in the light. Still others looked at Aethra with knowing eyes, understanding at last the secret she had kept for so many years. Yet none dared interfere, for all could sense that Theseus was no longer simply the youth of Troezen, was something greater, a figure whose story would reach far beyond their city. As he prepared to depart, he stood once more before his mother. "I will go to Athens," he said softly. "I will find my father, and whatever trials await me on the road, I will face them." Aethra embraced him, her eyes filled with both pride and sorrow. She had raised him with care, watched him grow, guided him to this moment, but now she had to let him go. His life was no longer hers to shape. It belonged to destiny, to Athens, to the gods themselves. And so, with sandals strapped, with sword at his side, with heart steady and strong, Theseus set his face toward the road. The journey would be long. The trials would be many. But each step he took carried him closer to the life he was meant to live. Picture him now, walking into the morning light, his figure small at first, then fading into the distance. The road stretches before him, winding through valleys and over hills, a ribbon of dust and promise. Along its length lie dangers, but also transformation. The youth of Troezen has become the traveler, the seeker, the heir, and though he does not yet know it, each challenge he meets will shape not only his story, but the story of Athens itself. His path will cross with bandits, with kings, with monsters, with destiny in all its forms. But for now, in this moment of calm departure, the tale pauses. He walks steadily, the sword catching the light, the sandals carrying him forward. The air is quiet, the world still, as though holding its breath for what is to come. Let the image settle gently in your mind. A young man on the road, his destiny beginning, the first steps of a story that will echo for ages. The details of his trials will come in time. For now, rest with the certainty that his journey has begun, and that he carries with him the weight of purpose, the strength of resolve, and the blessing of gods and mortals alike. The road beyond Epidaurus wound onward, curling like a pale ribbon across the hills. The countryside grew quieter the farther he traveled, and the people he passed were fewer, their faces brighter, now that the club-bearer no longer haunted their way. Many had heard already of his deed. Travelers whispered of the youth who had slain the son of Hephaestus, who had wrested the iron club from his hands, and turned it into a symbol of justice. They spoke in hushed tones, half with relief and half with awe, as though unsure whether to believe such tales. Theseus listened when they spoke, though he did not seek their praise. To him, the act had been necessary. It was not glory he sought, but a proving of himself, a quiet assurance that he was worthy to claim the destiny whispered since his birth. The stories others told were like ripples upon water, spreading outward, but he knew that each ripple came from the stone cast in silence at the center. Days passed. The sun rose and fell. The moon traced its silver arc across the heavens, and Theseus's feet carried him ever onward. Sometimes he walked beneath the shade of olive groves, their leaves whispering in the wind. Sometimes he trudged across open fields, where the heat pressed heavy upon his shoulders and sweat dampened his brow. He shared bread with shepherds, drank from cold streams, and sometimes found shelter in the rough barns of farmers who offered him a corner of straw. More often, he slept upon the earth itself, his cloak wrapped about him, the stars, 1,000 cold fires above his head dotted night. When silence wrapped around him and only the distant cry of owls stirred the air, he thought often of the weight of the club beside him. It lay heavy not just in his hands but in his heart, for it reminded him of what he had chosen. He could have taken the sea, he could have sailed safely to Athens, and his mother's fears might have been eased. But he had chosen instead to walk a road lined with shadows. The club was proof of that choice, proof that he would not turn away. Sometimes he wondered what his father would say when they met. Would Aegeus recognize him at once, in the tilt of his face, in the way he carried himself? Or would he doubt? Would he hesitate? Would he need to see the sword and sandals before belief stirred in his heart? And if he did recognize him, what then? Would he welcome him with open arms, or would suspicion cloud the moment? Theseus did not know, and so his thoughts circled endlessly, like the wheel of a cart turning down an endless road. Yet he did not dwell only on uncertainties. He also thought of the path of heroes, the strange and winding road that bound them. He had heard tales of Heracles, of Perseus, of others whose names echoed across Greece. They too had faced monsters and dangers, had endured hardship and trial. Heroes were not born by chance. They were shaped by the road, by the enemies they faced, by the choices they made when the world demanded courage. In the quiet of the night, as firelight flickered low, he felt that the road itself was shaping him with every step, every battle, every burden. It was in such thoughts that he walked into the next shadow upon his path. For beyond Epidaurus, the land grew rougher, the hills steeper, the roads narrower. Pines grew thick upon the slopes, their dark green needles whispering as the wind passed through them. It was here that the next terror of the road made his lair. His name was Sinis, though few spoke it without a shiver. He was known better by another title, the Pine-bender. A cruel man, he had devised a punishment. With his vast strength, he would bend the tall pines of the hills down to the earth, lashing them so that their tops nearly touched the ground. Then he would tie his victims to the tree's arms and legs fastened cruelly. When he released his grip, the trees would snap upward, tearing the bodies of men apart. The hills of Corinth knew his cruelty well, for many had perished in this way, their cries echoing through the pines. It was said he was the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. From his father he had inherited not just strength, but a restless cruelty, the tempestuous heart of a storm. Yet, where Poseidon ruled oceans, Cinyes ruled only the narrow roads, and he ruled them with blood. Travelers dreaded the region, and many chose long detours rather than pass through the pine-shadowed hills. Theseus had heard whispers of him even before he left Troezen. The name had followed him like a shadow, and now, as the trees thickened and the road narrowed, he felt its weight pressing upon him. He did not hurry, nor did he slow. He walked with the same steady stride, his eyes alert, his hand never far from the sword at his side, the iron club slung across his back like a burden and a promise. The first sign came not in sight but in sound, a sharp, unnatural crack, like the snap of wood pulled too far. Then, faint upon the air, a Chrython, human and desperate. Theseus paused, listening. The forest was otherwise still, the birds hushed as though unwilling to sing in the presence of cruelty. He moved forward, each step careful, until the trees opened to a clearing. There, before him, the truth of the whispers lay bare. A pine bent low, lashed cruelly to the ground. Upon it, bound and straining, a man cried out, his face contorted in fear. And beside him, towering and grim, stood Cinyes. His hands gripped the rope that held the tree, his muscles taut, his face twisted in cruel delight. He did not see Theseus at first, so intent was he on his work. But when the young hero stepped into the clearing, silent no longer, the bandit's head turned, his eyes flashing with challenge. Another voice might have trembled at the sight, might have begged for mercy, might have turned and fled. But Theseus spoke with calm certainty, his words slow and measured, as though the very air demanded quiet. "Release him," he said. "This road no longer belongs to cruelty." "It is enough," Cinyes laughed, a harsh bark like thunder rolling across stone. "Enough? Who are you to say what is enough? I am the master of these hills, and all who pass here pay my toll. Their lives are mine to claim, and you, boy, are mine now as well." The rope strained in his grip, the tree quivering, the victim's cries growing sharper. Theseus did not flinch. He stepped closer, his sword gleaming faintly in the dim light that filtered through the branches. "You say you are a master," he said, "but every master must one day meet another. Release him, or face me." For a moment, silence. Then Cinyes let out a roar and loosed the rope. The tree snapped upward, and the man upon it screamed before his voice was cut short. Theseus felt the sound shiver through his bones, a grim reminder of what cruelty could do. The bandit turned then, his hands free, his eyes burning with the fire of violence. He lunged, massive arms outstretched, seeking to seize Theseus as he had seized so many before. But the youth moved with the quickness of one who knew that hesitation was death. His sword flashed, striking against Cinyes's arm, drawing blood. The bandit howled, but his strength did not falter. He swung wide, striking with hands that could have crushed stone, and the air itself seemed to shudder with the force. The battle was fierce, a clash of strength against speed, of cruelty against justice. Cinyes fought like a storm, wild and unrelenting, while Theseus fought with focus, each movement chosen, each step measured. The clearing echoed with their struggle, the trees themselves seeming to lean close as if to witness. And though Cinyes's strength was vast, he met, at last, a strength greater still, not the strength of muscle, but the strength of purpose. For Theseus did not fight for himself alone. He fought for every traveler, every victim, every soul who had suffered in silence. And with that weight behind his blade, he struck true when Cinyes at last fell, his body broken upon the very ground he had claimed. The forest seemed to breathe again. Birds stirred in the branches, and the silence lifted. Theseus stood, his chest heaving, his sword darkened with blood, and looked upon the bandit's fallen form. He felt no joy, only the deep stillness that follows when justice has been done. Some say that Theseus, in a grim turn of justice, bound Cinyes to the very trees he had used upon others, letting him taste his own cruelty. Others say the bandit's death was swift, a single blow that ended his reign. Whichever the truth, the result was the same. The road was freed, the travelers safe once more. That night, as firelight flickered against the trunks of the pines, Theseus sat in silence. He thought of the man whose life had been ended before his eyes, the cruel laughter of Cinyes, the cries of his victims. The road was not merely a path to Athens, it was a mirror, showing him both the darkness of the world and the role he must play in cleansing it. He felt the burden heavy upon his shoulders, yet he bore it willingly. Sleep came slowly again, for the cries still echoed in his ears. Yet when it came, it brought with it dreams not of terror, but of a city by the sea, a city where his father waited, where destiny waited, where the trials of the road would at last be understood. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled above, and in the stillness of the pines, the figure of Theseus slept, the hero in the making, his journey far from done. Ahead lay more shadows, more trials, more adversaries whose names still whispered across the ages. But for now, he rested, one step closer to Athens, one step closer to the labyrinth of fate. The days in Athens began to carry a heavy tension, as though the city itself held its breath. The people lived with a wound that never healed, the tribute demanded by Crete every few years. Black-sailed ships came from across the sea, and from them stepped the messengers of King Minos. They did not come in haste, nor with the fury of soldiers, but with the terrible calm of those who know their demands cannot be refused. They would stand before Aegeus, deliver the decree, and wait as names were drawn. 7 boys, 7 girls, the number never changed. Each time the city shuddered with grief. Families wailed, neighbors whispered prayers, and the chosen were gathered together to begin their journey to Crete. Few returned, and those who did spoke of darkness and a monster beneath the palace of Knossos. Some said it was half man, half bull, born of a strange and shameful union. Some said it was no beast at all, but a punishment sent by the gods themselves. Whatever the truth, it was a fate worse than death. And Athens endured it again and again. It was in this atmosphere of dread that Theseus, now grown tall and strong, learned of the tribute. The news was not whispered to him in secret. It was in the air, on the lips of every citizen. The grief was a chorus that rang through the city, and he listened with the sharpness of one who understood that sorrow could not continue forever. Something had to change. When the day of the drawing came, crowds filled the square. The names were chosen, each one a dagger to the hearts of the waiting families. Mothers clutched their children, fathers held their heads in despair, and the chosen youths stood pale and trembling. their eyes already turned toward the sea that would carry them away. Aegeus, weary with age and sorrow, watched from his throne. He had presided over this ritual before, and each time his heart weakened a little more. To him, it was a necessary submission, a way to keep Athens from ruin. But to Theseus, watching from the crowd, it was an unbearable humiliation. He stepped forward. His voice rang out clear and firm, though the square was heavy with grief. He declared that he would join the chosen, not as a victim, not as one dragged into the darkness, but as a volunteer. Aegeus's eyes widened in disbelief. The people gasped, for none had ever spoken such words. Theseus, son of Athens, heir of Aegeus, offering himself to Crete was unthinkable. Aegeus descended from his seat, his voice trembling with anger and fear. He begged his son not to go. He had only just found him, only just embraced the hope that Athens would endure through his line. To lose him now, swallowed by the labyrinth, would be a second tragedy, one too great for the city or for a father to bear. But Theseus was firm. He spoke calmly, yet with fire beneath his words. If Athens was to be free, someone must confront the terror in Crete. Someone must stand not as tribute, but as challenger. He would go, he said, and he would return victorious. The people were torn. Some wept at his bravery, seeing in him a light that had long been missing from their city. Others feared he was throwing his life away. Aegeus clutched at him, warning him of the cunning of Minos, of the whispers of gods and monsters. But Theseus would not yield. At last, with a heavy heart, the king relented. He placed his hands on his son's shoulders and gave him his blessing, though his eyes betrayed the fear that lingered within. As preparations were made, Theseus visited the chosen youths. They were pale, hollow-eyed, consumed by dread. He spoke to them gently, assuring them that they were not lambs to slaughter, that he would be with them, that they must hold hope in their hearts. His calm steadiness began to ripple through them, and though fear still clung like a shadow, it was not as suffocating as before. For the first time, they had a protector among them. The black-sailed ship awaited at the harbor, its timbers creaking, its mast reaching like a dark finger into the sky. On the morning of departure, the people of Athens gathered to watch. The sea breeze carried with it the scent of salt and the faint tang of sorrow. Families clung together, bidding farewell to their children, their tears falling into the dust at their feet. Theseus stood tall at the front, not shrinking from the moment, but carrying himself with the quiet dignity of a man who bore not only his own fate, but the fate of his city. Before he left, Aegeus pulled him close once more. He told his son that if he were to succeed, if he were to return, he must signal to Athens that victory had been won. The ship carried 2 sets of sails, one black, one white. If Theseus were to live, if he were to overcome the monster, he must raise the white sails on the journey home. If not, if only the black sails returned, then Athens would know its prince was lost. Theseus listened carefully, nodded, and embraced his father. Yet in the embrace, Aegeus felt a trembling. Was it his own? Or did even his brave son sense the enormity of the task ahead? The ship pushed from the shore. Oars dipped into the water, cutting through the waves in steady rhythm. The cries of the people grew fainter as Athens receded into the distance, its white walls gleaming against the hills. The horizon opened wide, the sea stretching endlessly before them. For the youths on board, it was a passage into terror. But for Theseus, it was a journey into destiny. The days at sea passed with a slow rhythm. The waves rocked the ship, the sails strained against the wind, and the sun burned upon their backs. At night, the stars stretched vast above them, constellations telling the stories of gods and heroes. Theseus would look up, his mind wandering to those who had come before him. Heracles, who had faced beasts and triumphed. Perseus, who had slain the Gorgon. Could he to carve his name among such figures? Or was he destined to vanish into the darkness of the labyrinth, forgotten save for the grief of his father? He moved among the youths, offering comfort, keeping their spirits steady. He taught them songs to ease their minds, told them stories to soften the edge of fear. They clung to his presence, drawing strength from his calmness. Even as the shadow of Crete grew nearer, he did not falter, for he knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. And yet, in his quiet moments, when the sea whispered against the hull and the stars shimmered above, Theseus felt the weight of what lay ahead. King Minos was no ordinary ruler. His power stretched across the sea. His ships commanded respect and fear alike. His palace at Naxos was said to be vast and magnificent, filled with winding corridors and painted walls that dazzled the eye. But beneath that palace lay the labyrinth, built by the cunning craftsman Daedalus. It was a maze so intricate that none who entered ever found their way out again. And at its heart, the Minotaur waited. Theseus thought of the beast. Some described it as a creature with the body of a man and the head of a bull, a symbol of brute strength and insatiable hunger. Others whispered it was the child of a queen cursed by the gods, an abomination born of divine anger. Whatever it was unlike anything Theseus had faced before. Yet he did not turn his thoughts away from it. Instead, he met them steadily, as one might stare into the eyes of a storm. For he knew that monsters, however terrible, could be faced. The voyage stretched on, each day carrying them closer to Crete. The youths whispered among themselves, sometimes crying quietly in the dark, sometimes finding brief moments of laughter as Theseus urged them to sing. He became their anchor, their light in the midst of uncertainty. And slowly, something remarkable happened. Their fear began to transform. It did not vanish, but it reshaped itself into a kind of resolve. They began to believe that perhaps, with Theseus at their side, they might yet survive. At last, Crete rose on the horizon. The island appeared like a dark shape against the blue, its mountains rising steep and imposing. As the ship drew nearer, the palace of Naxos came into view, perched upon its hill like a crown. The sight silenced the youths. Their songs ceased, their voices fell still, and all eyes turned toward the looming seat of Minos. The harbor was busy, filled with ships and merchants, soldiers and slaves. The Athenians were herded ashore, watched closely by guards in bronze armor, their spears gleaming in the sun. The streets of Naxos wound upward, filled with the scents of spices and smoke, the sounds of hammers and voices. But above it all, towering over the city, was the palace itself, a labyrinth of halls and chambers, its walls painted with scenes of dancers, bulls, and gods. To the Athenians, it seemed at once magnificent and terrifying. And then came Minos. The king was tall, stern, and unyielding, his presence filling the hall like a thundercloud. His eyes swept over the youths with cold indifference, as though they were little more than tokens in a game already won. But when his gaze settled on Theseus, it lingered. Perhaps he saw the strength in the young man's frame, the steadiness in his eyes. Perhaps he recognized something that set him apart from the others. Whatever he saw, his lips curved into the faintest trace of a smiler smile without warmth, but full of calculation in that moment. The air grew heavy, as though the fate of Athens, of Crete, of Theseus himself had shifted. The shadow of Minos stretched long over them all, and the labyrinth below seemed to stir in its depths, awaiting the steps of its next victims. But Theseus did not flinch. He met the gaze of the king calmly, neither bowing in fear nor bristling in defiance. He stood as he had on the day he volunteered, steady and unshaken, for he knew the battle was not yet begun. The voyage was over, but the true trial was only just beginning. The palace of Nasus was a place unlike any Theseus had ever seen. Its walls shimmered with colors, painted frescoes of dancers leaping over bowls, spirals of blue that evoked the sea, and figures of gods and priestesses in flowing garments. The air was heavy with incense, the echo of footsteps carrying through endless corridors. To the Athenians who had been brought as tribute, it was both dazzling and suffocating. The beauty of the palace was like a mask, and beneath it lay the knowledge of why they had been brought here. Each day that passed inside its walls, the shadow of the labyrinth seemed to grow larger. Whispers reached their ears, stories of youths who had gone before them, of screams swallowed by stone walls, of bones left behind in the dark. No one who entered the labyrinth had ever emerged again. It was a place of endings, and each of them knew that soon their feet would tread its paths. Theseus, however, remained calm. He moved through the palace with quiet steadiness, never letting fear find purchase in his voice or in his manner. The others drew strength from him, though the weight of their fate pressed heavily upon their shoulders. Even in his own private moments, when silence wrapped itself around him, he did not give himself to despair. He understood something the others did not, that fear could be broken, that monsters, however terrible, could be slain. It was during these days that she appeared. Ariadne, daughter of King Minos, was unlike the guards who watched them, or the courtiers who passed them by with distant eyes. She had a light in her that was difficult to ignore, a brightness that seemed out of place in the palace's heavy air. Her beauty was spoken of across Crete hair like dark silk, eyes that carried both softness and sharpness, movements with the grace of a dancer. But beauty was not what drew Theseus's attention. It was something else, something quieter, the look she gave him when others were not watching. A look that seemed to say she saw more in him than the role of sacrifice. Some say it was love at first sight, that Ariadne's heart leaped the moment she beheld him, strong and steady among the doomed. Others say it was the gods who stirred her heart, guiding her toward him because fate demanded it. Whatever the truth, Ariadne began to seek him out. In quiet moments, when the palace's endless corridors were nearly empty, she would cross his path. At first, she spoke little brief glances, the smallest words of greeting. But soon, whispers grew into conversations. She asked him of Athens, of the city that lay across the sea. He told her of olive groves shimmering in the sun, of the Acropolis rising proud above the land. a festivals filled with music and dancing. She listened with longing, as though she had never breathed such air, as though she lived in a gilded cage, and his words were glimpses of freedom. And he, in turn, asked her of Crete, though she seemed reluctant to speak. Her words skirted the darker truths, yet he could sense them in the spaces between her sentences. The labyrinth, the beast, the iron grip of her father's rule. It was in one of these hushed meetings that Ariadne's voice trembled with urgency. She told him that she could not bear to see him lost to the labyrinth, that there was no one else among the tributes who carried himself as he did, with calm courage, that if there were any chance, any at all, of ending the terror of the Minotaur, it rested with him. Her eyes shone not only with fear but with hope, fragile and flickering like a flame in the wind. Then she revealed what she knew. The labyrinth, she whispered, was not simply a place of walls. It was a trap of the mind, designed by Daedalus to confound all who entered. Its corridors twisted endlessly, doubling back on themselves, leading wanderers in circles until exhaustion claimed them. The Minotaur did not need to hunt. The maze itself delivered prey into its grasp, but Ariadne had learned something, a secret, a way through. Daedalus, cunning though he was, had not been able to erase all paths of survival. If Theseus could mark his way, if he could leave behind a trail, then he might find his way back out. She promised to help him. She would give him a ball of thread, simple in its appearance, but powerful in what it could mean. He would tie one end at the entrance of the labyrinth and carry the ball with him as he went. As he moved deeper, he would unwind it, leaving a line to follow home again. In this way, he could face the beast without being lost forever in the twisting dark. Her voice shook as she offered this gift, for she knew what it meant. To aid him was to betray her father, to betray Crete if discovered. Her fate would be sealed, but she did not waver. Her heart, whether guided by love or by destiny, was fixed upon him. Theseus listened with calm attention, nodding as she spoke. When she had finished, he reached for her hand and held it gently. He did not speak loudly, nor make bold declarations. Instead, he thanked her softly, as one would thank a companion in the truest sense. He promised that if he lived, he would not forget her kindness. He promised that if Athens was freed, it would be because of her courage as much as his own. The night before they were to be sent into the labyrinth, Ariadne met him one final time in secret. She pressed the ball of thread into his hands, her fingers lingering upon his as though unwilling to let go. She told him that if he succeeded, he must take her with him, away from Crete, away from the shadow of her father. He agreed, though in that moment what lay ahead was so vast and uncertain that even promises felt fragile. Yet he meant his words, spoken with quiet sincerity beneath the stars. And so dawn came. The youths were gathered, their faces pale with fear, their bodies trembling as they were led to the entrance of the labyrinth. The great stone mouth yawned before them, dark and unwelcoming. Guards stood watch, their expressions unreadable, while priests muttered prayers to gods both known and half forgotten. The scent of incense and blood mingled in the air, heavy and cloying. Theseus stood at the front, the ball of thread hidden beneath his garment, its weight small yet immense. His heart beat steadily, not with the panic of despair, but with the focus of one who had chosen his path. He tied the end of the thread to a stone at the entrance, his movements hidden by the shuffle of feet. None noticed, not even the guards, for who would look for such a simple act? And then, one by one, they were ushered inside. The air within was cool and damp, thick with the scent of stone and earth. The sound of footsteps echoed strangely, swallowed and twisted by the corridors. The light dimmed as they moved deeper, torches flickering weakly against the vast walls. The labyrinth stretched out before them, a maze of passageways that bent and wound upon themselves with no clear order. It was a place designed to disorient, to consume hope. Theseus unwound the thread carefully as he walked, letting it trail behind him, invisible to all but him and Ariadne. His hand remained steady, his mind calm. Around him, the other youths huddled close, their voices hushed with dread. Some whispered prayers, others wept quietly, their eyes darting into the shadows as though expecting the beast at every turn. The silence was broken only by the distant drip of water and the faint rustle of unseen things in the dark. Every corner turned revealed only more corridors, more endless walls. It was as Ariadne had said, the labyrinth itself was a predator, luring them deeper, sapping their strength, gnawing at their resolve. But Theseus did not falter. Each step carried him closer to the heart of the maze, where he knew the Minotaur waited. The weight of his sword at his side was a comfort, its hilt warm in his grasp when he touched it briefly for reassurance. The thread unwound steadily, linking him to the world above, to Ariadne's faith, to the promise of escape. The others clung to him, following his lead. In their eyes, he was not merely a fellow tribute. He was their guide, their protector, their last hope. And though fear gnawed at them, it could not fully consume them, for he walked among them like a flame that would not be extinguished. The labyrinth stretched onward, its passages winding endlessly. The air grew heavier, as though pressing down upon them. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow deeper. Somewhere ahead, faint and distant, came a sound that was not their own, a low, guttural noise, like the growl of something both man and beast. The youths froze, their eyes wide. But Theseus only lifted his hand, steadying them, urging silence. His own breath came slow and even, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. He knew that the moment he had awaited was near. The first steps had been taken. The path had been marked. The labyrinth had welcomed them into its depths. And now, in its heart, the Minotaur stirred. The labyrinth deepened around them, as though each corridor pressed the air into something heavier, thicker, more difficult to draw into the lungs. The youths who had been brought with Theseus clung together in uneasy silence, their torches held high, though the light seemed to stretch no further than a few paces ahead. Every twist of the passage looked much like the last stone walls, damp with condensation, bending away to the left, to the right, leading downward, always downward. Yet Theseus remained steady. With one hand he unwound the thread Ariadne had given him, its delicate line tracing behind him like a fragile lifeline back to the world above. With the other, he carried his torch, the flame trembling slightly, but refusing to die. His sword hung at his side, not yet drawn, but present, its weight a silent reminder of the confrontation to come. The others whispered among themselves, voices low, fear clinging to their words. They wondered if the monster had heard them already. if its hooves or claws scraped upon the stones somewhere ahead. They wondered if they would die without ever seeing the sun again. And yet they followed Theseus, for his calm was the anchor they needed. He did not move quickly, but neither did he pause unnecessarily. He walked as though each step was chosen, as though he could see through the tricks of the maze. The thread unfurling behind him was his unseen guide, but to the others, it seemed as though he alone possessed the strength to lead them onward. The labyrinth was a place designed to break the mind before the body. The endless repetition of passages eroded the sense of direction. Shadows moved oddly, bending in ways that unsettled the eye. The silence was never complete. Faint noises echoed from unseen corners, drips of water, the shifting of stone, perhaps even the faint rumble of the beast that claimed this place as its lair. The young Athenians' fear was not unfounded. For centuries, none had ever escaped these twisting halls, and the bones of the lost lay scattered in chambers the group did not yet see. After what felt like hours, though time had lost all clear measure, the air changed. It carried with it a heavier scent, something pungent, animal-like, as though the very stones had absorbed the musk of the beast. Theseus lifted his hand, signaling for silence. The others froze, their breaths caught in their throats. He tilted his head, listening, and there it was, the faint scrape of movement deeper ahead. Not the steps of men, but something larger, something that breathed with a weight not human. The Minotaur was near. The youths looked to Theseus, their faces pale in the flickering torchlight. He studied them quietly, then spoke in a calm tone, steady and soft, as though speaking to children on the verge of sleep. He told them to stay together, to hold their torches close, and to remain where they were until he returned. He did not allow them to protest, though fear trembled on their lips. He promised them that this was his task, his fate, and that if he succeeded, they would walk free again under the open sky. If he failed, though he did not dwell upon the word, they would at least have time to retrace their steps along the thread he had laid. They did not argue, though dread filled their eyes. Instead, they watched as he untied his sword, the blade sliding free with a whisper of metal. Its edge caught the torchlight, gleaming faintly in the dark. Theseus set his jaw, his face calm but resolute, and then, with the ball of thread still unwinding in his hand, he walked forward into the deeper dark. The labyrinth narrowed, then widened again into a chamber larger than any he had yet seen. The torchlight stretched further here, revealing high walls and a ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was littered with fragments of bone, the remnants of those who had come before. Some were gnawed clean, others still bore the marks of teeth that had torn through flesh and sinew. The smell was stronger now, heavy and foul, clinging to the air like a shroud. And then he saw it. The Minotaur emerged from the shadows with a sound that was neither fully roar nor bellow, but some monstrous mingling of both. Its body was massive, taller than any man, broad-shouldered and thick with muscle. Its legs ended in hooves that struck the stone with each step, echoing through the chamber. Its arms were long and powerful, ending in hands with fingers that curled like claws. But it was the head that chilled the blood, the broad, horned head of a bull, eyes burning with feral rage, nostrils flaring as it scented the intruder. It was a creature born of both man and beast, a living embodiment of unnatural union, of punishment and shame. Yet for all its strangeness, there was nothing pitiable in its gaze. It looked upon Theseus, not as kin, not as man, but as prey. The torchlight flickered across the monster's horns as it lowered its head and bellowed again, the sound reverberating like thunder in the stone chamber. The very walls seemed to tremble with it. Theseus tightened his grip on his sword and let the thread slip from his hand, the ball resting against the stones where he stood. The line remained taut behind him, the path still secure. He raised his blade, his body steady, his breathing slow. The Minotaur charged. Its hooves thundered against the floor, its massive arms swinging wide as it rushed toward him. Theseus did not stand still, nor did he retreat in panic. Instead, he stepped lightly aside, the beast's bulk thundering past him by the narrowest of margins. The rush of air as it passed was like a storm, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. It wheeled, snorting, furious that its prey had not fallen. Theseus held his ground, his eyes never leaving the beast. He waited, patient, calm, watching the way it moved. The Minotaur lowered its head again, its horns gleaming wickedly. It pawed the ground like a bull, then lunged once more. This time, Theseus did not sidestep fully. He moved just enough to avoid the brunt of the charge, then slashed with his sword, the blade striking across the beast's shoulder. The cut was deep, and the Minotaur roared in pain, staggering slightly before turning on him again. The battle stretched onward, each movement a test of strength and resolve. The Minotaur swung its massive arms, striking the air with force that could have broken bones had it connected. Theseus ducked, sidestepped, struck when he could. His sword flashed in the torchlight, drawing lines of blood upon the monster's hide. Yet the beast did not weaken easily. Its rage was immense, its power undiminished, even as wounds opened upon its body. The clash was a dance of survival. Theseus moved with agility, never meeting the brute force head-on, but using the creature's own momentum against it. Again and again, the Minotaur lunged, and again he turned its strength aside, striking in moments when its defenses were open. Still, the battle wore on, and sweat dripped from his brow. His breaths came deeper, his arm ached with the effort of each swing, but his resolve did not falter. At last, the opening came. The Minotaur, enraged beyond reason, lowered its head and charged one final time, its horns aimed directly at him. Theseus did not step aside. Instead, he planted his feet, waited until the very last heartbeat, and then leaped aside, driving his sword upward with all his strength. The blade pierced beneath the beast's neck, driving deep into its chest. The Minotaur let out a sound that shook the chamber, a roar that echoed like the breaking of the world. Its massive body convulsed, staggering forward a few paces before collapsing to the ground with a crash that sent dust billowing into the air. It shuddered once more, then lay still, its breath gone, its eyes dimming into lifelessness. For a long moment, silence hung heavy in the chamber. Theseus stood motionless, his sword buried deep in the monster's chest, his breaths steady but heavy. Slowly, he drew the blade free, wiping it clean against the beast's hide. The labyrinth seemed to exhale, as though the death of its guardian had released something held for far too long. He bent, gathering the thread once more, and turned back the way he had come. Step by step, he followed the line, retracing the path he had marked. His torch flickered, but it held. Behind him, the chamber lay quiet, the beast slain, the bones of the lost finally at rest. When he returned to the place where the other youths waited, their eyes widened with disbelief. They had heard the roar, the clash of battle, the silence that followed, and now they saw him, bloodied but alive, his sword dark with the monster's lifeblood. For a moment they were silent, unable to comprehend what stood before them. Then whispers rose, first in awe, then in relief, then in joy. He did not linger on their praise. He urged them to follow quickly, guiding them along the thread that led back to the entrance. Step by step, they retraced their journey until, at last, light appeared ahead. The pale glow of the outside world filtered into the darkness, growing brighter with each step, and then they emerged, blinking in the sunlight, their lungs filling with fresh air for the first time in what felt like eternity. At the threshold, Ariadne stood waiting. Her eyes widened as she saw him approach, alive, leading the youths who had been marked for death. Relief and joy flooded her face, mingled with wonder at the impossible. Theseus stepped forward, and for a moment the world seemed to still. He had done what none before him had achieved. He had slain the Minotaur, broken the terror of the labyrinth, and brought hope where there had been only despair. He did not raise his sword in triumph, nor boast of his strength. Instead, he bowed his head briefly to Ariadne, acknowledging the truth of what they both knew, that his victory had been made possible not by his strength alone, but by her courage, her gift, her trust. The labyrinth was silent now. Its guardian lay slain in the shadowed depths, and the line of thread still stretched outward toward the entrance. Theseus gathered the youths, speaking softly, urging them forward with the calm tone of one who did not wish to disturb a resting house. Step by step, they traced the path until the cool breath of the night air touched their faces. The torches sputtered out in the wind, and above them the stars looked down, vast and unblinking, as though bearing witness to what had been done. There, waiting at the threshold, was Ariadne. She had stood in anxious silence, her heart caught between hope and despair, wondering if the sound of the Minotaur's roar had marked Theseus's death. But when she saw him emerge alive, leading those who had been destined for sacrifice, she felt a surge of relief so great that it brought tears to her eyes. For a moment, she did not speak. She simply met his gaze, and he bowed his head in quiet acknowledgement of all she had risked for him. The city of Nasus slept in uneasy ignorance. No guards patrolled the path that night. No torches flared on the walls. Minos had believed the labyrinth a perfect prison, its guardian undefeatable. Yet, while he dreamt in his palace, his daughter stood beside Theseus, whispering that now was the moment to flee. They had no time for hesitation. The band of Athenians moved swiftly through the night, guided by Ariadne's knowledge of hidden ways. Down narrow paths they went, across the outer courts, past silent statues that seemed to watch their passing. Their sandals touched the earth with the caution of those who knew discovery would mean death. Yet the gods, or perhaps fortune, favored them, and soon they reached the harbor where the black-sailed ship of Athens rested. The vessel was sturdy but plain, built for the sea's long reach rather than speed. Its timbers creaked as the group climbed aboard, the ropes groaning as the sail was ready. The Athenians moved in silence, their hearts thundering with urgency. Theseus himself cast the moorings free, his hands steady, though his spirit surged with anticipation. Ariadne stood beside him, the salt wind lifting her hair, her face turned toward the wide, dark sea. Then the oars dipped into the water, the sail caught the night breeze, and the ship slipped out from the Cretan shore. Behind them, the island faded into darkness, its palaces hidden, its labyrinth silent, its king unaware that his power had been broken. The Athenians watched the receding land with a strange mixture of fear and relief, knowing they had left behind both death and danger. Ariadne, though, kept her eyes forward. She had not only left her father's house, but her whole world. The choice she had made was final. The sea stretched wide before them. By day it glimmered under the sun. By night it lay still and dark, a mirror to the stars above. The ship carried its passengers steadily northward, the rhythm of the oars soothing, the creak of the wood familiar, almost lulling. At last, the danger of the labyrinth seemed to fall away, replaced by the timeless hush of the waves. For the Athenians, the days that followed felt like a rebirth. Each dawn brought light not of a prison, but of freedom. They spoke quietly of home, of family, of the lives they might resume. Some wept when they remembered those left behind, the youths who had gone before and never returned. But even their grief was softened by relief, for at last their suffering had ended. In this quiet, Ariadne and Theseus drew close. She had risked all for him, leaving behind her father's palace and her birthright as princess of Crete in return. He spoke to her not as a stranger, but as one bound to her by fate. Their conversations, held on the ship's deck beneath the stars, stretched late into the night. They spoke of Athens, of the life she would find there, of how her courage had saved not just him, but all who sailed with them. In those still hours, a bond seemed to grow between them, fragile but real. Yet the sea is a place of shifting moods, and even in calm waters, uncertainty lingers. The gods who ruled those tides were capricious, and their will was not easily known. As the ship moved onward, a sense of unease sometimes crept across Theseus's heart, though he could not name its cause. Ariadne, too, would sometimes gaze out at the horizon, as though listening for something beyond the reach of human ears. One night, when the moon lay low over the water, the ship anchored off the island of Naxos. The voyage had been long, and the crew needed rest. The shore was quiet, the sands pale under starlight. They disembarked, stretching their limbs, grateful to feel solid earth beneath their feet. Fires were lit, food was shared, and for the first time since leaving Crete, laughter rose among the youths. They felt safe, as though their trials had at last ended. It was here, on Naxos, that the story darkens, though the reasons are told in many ways. Some say that Dionysus, the god of wine and ecstasy, appeared to Theseus in a dream, commanding him to leave Ariadne upon the island, for she was destined to be his bride. Others claim that Theseus, fearing the wrath of Minos, doubted whether he could protect her in Athens, and chose instead to abandon her. Still others whisper that the goddess Athena herself appeared, reminding him of his duty to his city and warning that his path could not be bound to hers. Whatever the truth, when the ship departed Naxos at dawn, Ariadne did not rise with it. She lay upon the shore, her eyes opening to the sound of waves and gulls, only to see the sails already fading against the horizon. Alone, she wept, her heart heavy with betrayal, or perhaps with the strange fulfillment of a fate larger than mortal choice. For in time, it was said, Dionysus did indeed find her there, and she was lifted to a life among the gods, her crown set among the stars as the constellation Corona Borealis. But for Theseus, the weight of that departure never left him. As the ship cut through the waters toward Athens, silence often fell upon him. His thoughts turned to his father, to the promise he had made before leaving, and to the black sails that still billowed above the mast. For in the haste of departure, in the fog of exhaustion and triumph, he had forgotten the signal agreed upon. White sails for victory, black sails for death. The voyage drew to its end. The hills of Attica rose upon the horizon, the familiar outline of home. The Athenians aboard wept for joy, shouting to one another, pointing toward the land that had waited for them. Theseus stood at the prow, watching the coast draw near. Relief filled his chest, but with it came a shadow, for he knew what waited on the cliffs above. In Athens, King Aegeus had kept vigil for his son. Day after day, he had climbed to the heights overlooking the sea, his eyes straining toward the horizon. He had prayed to the gods for the safe return of the ship, for the sight of the white sail that would tell him Theseus lived. Yet, when the black sail appeared against the morning light, his heart broke. Believing his son lost, Aegeus threw himself from the cliffs into the sea below. The waters closed over him, and the sea has borne his name ever since, the Aegean, in memory of a father who could not endure the loss of his child. When Theseus at last stepped ashore, the cheers of the Athenians could not quiet the grief that greeted him. Word of his father's death struck him as sharply as any blade. He had returned victorious, but his triumph was mingled with sorrow. He had freed his people from the terror of the Minotaur, yet the cost was greater than he had foreseen. In the days that followed, Theseus was crowned as king, for Aegeus was no more, but the crown was heavy upon his brow. He had slain the beast of Crete. He had led the youths of Athens to safety. Yet he had lost Ariadne to the sea's horizon, and his father to the cliffs of his own homeland. Victory and tragedy had walked together, bound as closely as the thread that once guided him through the labyrinth. So the story closes, not with the exultation of a hero's triumph, but with the quiet mingling of light and shadow. Theseus had faced the darkness and overcome it, but even in victory, he learned that the weaving of fate does not always follow the straight path of desire. For every thread that leads us out of the labyrinth, another may bind us to sorrow. And perhaps it is this lesson, as much as the slaying of the Minotaur, that makes his tale endure across the centuries. The sea that bore his father's name stretched wide and calm below the cliffs of Athens. The city itself, perched upon its rocky heights, looked down on the waters with a quiet majesty. Yet, within its walls, sorrow mingled with expectation. Aegeus was gone, claimed by the depths, and the people now turned their eyes to the man who had returned from Crete, bearing both victory and grief. Theseus was no longer a prince, no longer merely the son who had set out on a dangerous voyage. He was now their king. The crown, though, sat heavy upon his head. When he first entered the palace, its halls still bore the silence of mourning. The servants bowed low, their eyes cast downward, not in celebration, but in respect for the dead. The throne itself, carved of stone and draped in cloth, seemed less a seat of power than a reminder of loss. Theseus mounted it slowly, his heart still caught between triumph and sorrow. For all the joy of Athens saved, the absence of his father weighed heavily upon him. In the days that followed, Theseus began the work of rule. The city looked to him not only as heir, but as hero. He had defeated the Minotaur, freed Athens from the dreadful tribute of youths, and brought back hope from across the sea. His name carried with it the promise of renewal. Yet Theseus knew that a hero's work was not the same as a king's. To wield a sword was one thing, to govern a people another. Athens at that time was not yet the city of later glory, with marble temples rising into the sky and philosophers filling its squares. It was still a place of scattered villages, each with its own customs, its own loyalties, its own jealousies. Attica, the land surrounding Athens, was divided into many small communities. Some clung to the hills, others to the plains, and still others to the shore. They looked inward to their own affairs and mistrusted one another. If Athens was to thrive, Theseus knew it must become one people, united not only by necessity but by identity. So he set himself to the task of unification. He traveled the land, visiting each of the small settlements, speaking not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor. He promised them equality, that no village would stand above another, that all would share in the governance of the land. He spoke of Athens as the hearth around which all Attica might gather, not to lose themselves, but to strengthen one another. Slowly, the villages agreed. One by one, they bound themselves to a greater whole, until the scattered people of Attica began to think of themselves not as rivals, but as Athenians. To mark this union, Theseus established a common festival, to share in sacrifice and feasting, to remind themselves that they were no longer divided. It was not only a political act, but a cultural one, weaving bonds stronger than any decree. Alongside unity, Theseus turned his mind to governance. He reformed the laws, ensuring that justice was not reserved for the wealthy or the powerful. He reduced the authority of kingship itself, choosing instead to grant the people a greater voice. Some say he was among the first to lay the foundation of democracy, planting seeds that would only flourish centuries later. He divided the citizens into classes according to their contributions. Nobles, farmers, craftsmen, yet bound them together under the law. By these reforms, he lessened the burden of tyranny and offered his people a share in their own future. Life in Athens began to change. The scattered markets of the villages grew into a central marketplace, where goods from the hills, the plains, and the coast mingled together. Craftsmen exchanged their wares, farmers sold their grain, shepherds brought their flocks. The hum of voices in many dialects blended into one common tongue, and the city's identity began to take shape. Theseus himself walked among them, often, not cloaked in distance, but present as a man of the people. Children ran beside him, laughing, their parents bowing in respect. He listened to the grievances of farmers, the petitions of artisans, the hopes of elders. In him they saw not only a ruler, but a figure larger than life, a hero who had stepped from the realm of myth into their streets. Yet there was always a tension within him, a pull between two roles. As king, he was bound to the daily cares of governance, to laws and decrees to the slow, patient labor of building a city. As hero, he was drawn toward deeds of adventure, toward the kind of glory that echoed across Greece. Sometimes, when the council chambers grew stifling with debate, he would glance toward the horizon and feel the old stirrings of the road, the call of quests not yet undertaken for the people. This duality was both a blessing and a burden. They loved him for his courage, for the deeds that had already become legend, but they also needed him steady, rooted in Athens, guiding the fragile unity he had forged. Theseus himself struggled with the balance. At night, in the palace halls, he would pace beneath the torches, his thoughts torn between the needs of his people and the restless hunger for more. Still, his reforms took hold. The villages of Attica grew stronger in their bonds. The festival of union was celebrated each year with greater fervor, and Athens itself began to stand apart as a city of order and promise. Where once it had been overshadowed by Thebes, by Corinth, by Sparta, it now began to whisper of a future that might rival them all. In quiet moments, Theseus would stand upon the Acropolis, the rocky hill that overlooked the city. From there he could see the scattered dwellings below, the markets bustling with trade, the fields stretching out into the distance, and the sea beyond, its waves carrying the memory of his father. He would breathe the air and think of what Athens might one day become: a city of justice, of strength, of culture, a city not merely his, but one that belonged to its people. And yet, in those same moments, he felt the weight of myth pressing upon him. Already the poets sang of his deeds. Already children played games pretending to be the slayer of the Minotaur. His life was becoming a story even as he lived it, shaped not only by his actions but by the way others retold them. To be a man and a myth at once was no easy burden. Heroes, after all, are rarely granted peace. So began the reign of Theseus in Athens, not with the stillness of settled rule, but with the tension of transformation. He had united a people, begun reforms, and planted seeds that would outlast him. Yet within him burned the restless fire that had once driven him down the dangerous roads toward Athens, that had led him into the labyrinth's dark heart. He was king, yes, but he was also Theseus, and the story of his life was far from complete. When Theseus had secured his throne in Athens and bound Attica into one people, many might have expected that his story would quiet into the steady rhythm of kingship. A city, after all, requires patience, law, and constancy. Yet Theseus was never a man to remain long in one place. His restless spirit, the same force that had driven him to choose the perilous land route to Athens and to face the labyrinth's dark heart, now tugged at him again. He had tasted glory, and he had felt the eyes of Greece turn toward him. To remain still seemed to him almost unnatural, and so, after his reforms in Athens had taken root, Theseus turned outward once more. He looked to the wider world, to challenges that might secure Athens's reputation among the great powers of Greece. In this restless search, his path led him toward the Amazons, a people who lived at the edges of Greek imagination, half myth, half reality, fierce and mysterious. The Amazons were said to dwell far away, on the banks of the river Thermodon in Asia Minor, though some claimed their lands stretched even farther into the unknown regions beyond the Black Sea. They were described as warrior women, daughters of Ares, god of war, and the nymph Harmonia. Unlike the women of Greece, they lived not in the shadow of men, but as equals or even superiors among themselves. They ruled their own society, fought their own battles, and were renowned for their skill with bow, spear, and horse to the Greeks. The Amazons were at once fascinating and unsettling. They embodied a reversal of the order the Greeks held dear. Women were not meant to rule or to fight, and yet here was a people who did both. In stories told by travelers and poets, the Amazons became figures of both admiration and fear. To conquer them, or even to ally with them, was to prove oneself against the very boundaries of the known world. Theseus, like Heracles before him, felt the pull of their legend. Some say he joined an expedition of his own against them. Others claim that he accompanied Heracles on his famous ninth labor, when Heracles sought the girdle of Hippolyta, the Amazon queen. The tales vary, as myths often do, but they converge on one central event, an Amazon princess. The details differ depending on the storyteller. Some say that Theseus fought against the Amazons and, in the aftermath of victory, carried Antiope away as his prize. Others soften the tale, suggesting that Antiope came willingly, captivated by Theseus's strength and charisma. Still others claim that it was part of a political arrangement, a union that symbolized an uneasy truce between Greeks and Amazons. Whatever the truth, Antiope came to Athens with him, and her presence would change the course of his reign. The Amazons, of course, did not take this lightly. Whether she had been taken by force or had chosen to leave, her absence was felt as an insult to their people. The stories say that, not long after, the Amazons themselves marched on Athens, determined to reclaim her and to humble the city that had dared to lay hands on one of their own. For the Athenians, it was a moment of both fear and awe. To see an army of women, armored and mounted, thundering across the plains toward their walls, was unlike anything they had known. The clash that followed was remembered for generations as the Amazonomachi, the great battle against the Amazons. In the myths, it became a symbol of the triumph of order over chaos, of Greece over the foreign, of men over women. Yet, in the moment itself, it must have been a desperate and terrifying struggle. The Amazons pressed deep into the heart of Athens. Some accounts say they reached the very foot of the Acropolis, setting up camp within sight of the temples. For days, the fighting raged through the city's streets and out into the fields. Theseus himself led the defense, standing not only as king but as warrior, his sword flashing beneath the Athenian sun. Antiope, caught between two worlds, is said to have stood by his side, torn by loyalty to her people and her bond with him. In the end, Athens prevailed, whether through the strength of its defenders, through the leadership of Theseus, or through negotiation and truce. The Amazons were driven back. Peace was restored, though at great cost. The memory of the battle lingered long after, woven into Athens's identity. Artists carved scenes of the Amazonomachi onto temples. Sculptors froze the moment in marble. Poets recited the clash as if it had been the very struggle between civilization and the wild. Yet beneath the grandeur of the myth lay a more complicated truth. The Amazons were not simply enemies to be defeated. They were mirrors of a different possibility, a reminder that the world was larger than Greece, that other ways of living existed beyond its seas. Theseus's union with Antiope, however it began, brought that reminder directly into the heart of Athens. Their son Hippolytus would grow to embody the tension between the Greek and the Amazonian, between tradition and something new. For Theseus, the campaign against the Amazons was more than just another adventure. It blurred the line between myth and politics. By defeating them, more by claiming union with them, he projected Athens as a rising power, capable of standing alongside Heracles, capable of confronting even the most exotic and legendary foes. To his people, it was reassurance that their city was not merely a patchwork of villages bound together by law, but a force to be reckoned with across the Greek world. Still, the story carried its shadows. The abduction of Antiope, if abduction it was, hinted at the darker side of Theseus's character, the hero's tendency to take what he desired, regardless of cost. The war that followed showed how personal choices could ripple outward into conflict, drawing entire cities and peoples into strife. And Antiope herself, whether remembered as victim, lover, or queen, stood as a reminder of the human cost of such deeds. The Athenians, in time, turned the Amazon Amachi into a symbol of their own resilience. They carved it on the Parthenon centuries later, placing it alongside other battles that defined their mythic past. But for Theseus, it was not simply a symbol. It was lived experience. He had seen the Amazons ride through his streets, had felt the weight of their arrows, had stood with Antiope in the midst of battle. The legend grew large, but behind it was a man, making choices, facing consequences, shaping history, one uncertain step at a time. In the quiet after the war, Athens rebuilt. The smoke cleared, the wounded were tended, the dead were mourned. Theseus, once again, walked among his people, hearing their stories, offering his presence. Yet the restlessness within him did not fade. Each triumph only seemed to sharpen his hunger for the next. To live as both man and myth was to be forever caught in motion, never allowed to rest. And so his adventures did not end with the Amazons. He would go on to other campaigns, other deeds that blurred the boundary between politics and story, between history and legend. But the Amazon campaign and his union with Antiope left a mark not only upon Athens, but upon Theseus himself. It was a reminder that kingship was never simple, that every act carried both glory and shadow, that to be remembered in song was also to be bound by the weight of myth. As night settles in your imagination, picture the scene of Athens in those years. The Acropolis still rough stone rather than shining marble, the streets narrow and busy, the people carrying both pride and scars. And beyond, the memory of horse hooves echoing through the fields, of fierce women warriors riding into battle, their cries mingling with the clash of bronze. Theseus stands at the center of it, our king, hero, myth his story, weaving ever onward, shaped by choices both noble and flawed. For though he was a unifier and a reformer, though he brought peace and order to Attica, he was also a man drawn to adventure, to conquest, to the dangerous edge where human life meets legend. And in that edge, in that restless pursuit, he carved his place in history, not only as the slayer of the Minotaur, but as the king who faced the Amazons and brought their story into the heart of Athens. When Theseus had lived many years as king of Athens uniting Attica, strengthening its laws, and engraving his name into the fabric of Greek legend. This was Pirithous, a Thessalian prince, king of the Lapiths, and a man whose nature was as bold and impetuous as Theseus's own. The story of their meeting has the flavor of myth, for it begins not with a handshake or a council, but with a challenge of strength. Pirithous, hearing tales of Theseus's deeds, how he had slain the Minotaur, united a people, and faced the Amazons, wondered whether this Athenian king was truly as mighty as the songs claimed. To test him, Pirithous drove his herds into the plain of Marathon, seizing cattle that belonged to Theseus, and dared the Athenian to confront him. When Theseus rode out to meet the intruder, the two men prepared for battle. Each was strong, each fearless, each certain of his right. But in the moment before combat, something passed between them. Perhaps it was recognition, that quiet awareness that each had finally met a rival worthy of respect. Perhaps it was the realization that their strength, instead of being turned against one another, might be far better joined in alliance. Whatever the reason, swords were lowered and hostility dissolved. From that day, Theseus and Pirithous were not enemies, but companions, sworn brothers in arms, united by the restless daring that defined them both. Their friendship would carry them into deeds both glorious and reckless. Side by side, they sought challenges that tested the very boundaries of human endeavor. Some of their ventures were remembered with pride, others with sorrow, for the bond that tied them together drove them into places where mortal men were, never meant to tread. The wedding feast of Pirithous one of the earliest tales of their companionship comes from the wedding of Pirithous himself. In Thessaly, Pirithous married Hippodamia, and to celebrate the union, he invited not only his Lapithkin, but also the neighboring centaurs, creatures, half man and half horse. At first, the feast was mere cups of wine passed, songs lifted, laughter spilling into the night. But as the wine flowed more freely, the centaurs' wild natures grew unruly. Inflamed by drink and desire, they turned their eyes upon the women present. One, every Tyon, seized Hippodamia herself, while others followed suit, dragging Lapith women into their arms. Chaos erupted. The wedding feast dissolved into battle, the famous Centauromachi, a clash between the civilized Lapiths and the untamed centaurs. Tables overturned, goblets shattered, and the air filled with the sound of bronze against flesh, hooves against earth. In the heart of the melee stood Theseus. Though the wedding was not his own, he fought as fiercely as if it had been, cutting down the centaur, every Tyon with swift resolve. Together with Pirithous, he turned the tide of the struggle, rallying the Lapiths until the centaurs were driven away, their wildness broken against the determination of men who would not see, their women taken. The battle became more than a brawl at a feast. Like the Amazonomachi, it was remembered as a symbol, the triumph of order over chaos, of culture over barbarism. And at its center, again, stood Theseus and Pirithous, their friendship sealed in blood and valor, a pact of marriage yet. The two companions, bound by restless ambition, conceived of ventures that would test even the patience of the gods. Both men, it seems, felt that ordinary marriages were beneath them. They were heroes, after all, men whose names were sung in every corner of Greece. Should they not, then, wed women who were worthy of such renown? So they swore a pact, that each would seek a daughter of Zeus himself for his bride. It was a reckless oath, born of pride and daring, but once spoken, it drove them forward into deeds that bordered on hubris. Theseus, by this time, was a widower or perhaps estranged from Antiope. His eye turned toward Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus, and Leda, famed for her beauty, even in her youth. She was still but a girl, not yet of age, but Theseus, desiring her for himself, conspired with Pirithous to seize her. The two heroes journeyed to Sparta and carried Helen away, stealing her from her home. They brought her to Attica, where Theseus entrusted her to the care of his mother Aethra until she should come of age. Some traditions claim that Helen bore a child to Theseus, though most say she was rescued by her brothers. The Dioscuricaster and Pollux, who invaded Attica, reclaimed their sister and carried Aethra away in revenge. It is a tale that shows both the daring and the recklessness of Theseus and Pirithous. To steal Helen, later the cause of the Trojan War, was to set themselves against the powerful houses of Greece. Yet they acted as if nothing were beyond their grasp, as if divine lineage entitled them to take what they wished. The descent for Persephone, but the boldest and most disastrous of their ventures was yet to come. For once Theseus had claimed Helen, it was Pirithous' turn to fulfill the pact. And whom did he choose? None less than Persephone herself, queen of the underworld, wife of Hades. To abduct a mortal maiden was one thing. To attempt to steal a goddess from the realm of the dead was another entirely. Yet Pirithous, fired by ambition, declared his intent. Theseus, bound by oath and friendship, agreed to accompany him, though perhaps with more hesitation. The path they chose led not across fields or seas, but into the very depths of the earth. Together they journeyed to the underworld, guided by daring and by folly. At the gates of Hades they passed the watchful Cerberus, perhaps with words, perhaps with force the stories differ. At last they stood before the throne of the god himself. Hades, perceiving their intent, did not rage or strike them down at once. Instead, he welcomed them with a calm that masked his purpose. He invited them to sit, to rest from their long journey, offering them the rock of forgetfulness as a seat. Unwittingly, they accepted, and, in that moment, they were trapped. The rock clutched at their flesh, binding them in place. They could not rise, could not move. Their bold plan dissolved into silence, and they remained fixed there, prisoners in the house of death. There they might have stayed forever, had not Heracles, on his 12th labor, descended into the underworld to bring forth Cerberus. When he saw his friends, he stretched out his mighty hands. With great effort, he lifted Theseus from the rock, freeing him from his bonds. But when he tried the same with Pirithous, the earth shook, and the ground groaned in protest. Pirithous was not to be released. His hubris had gone too far, and so he remained bound in Hades, a warning to all who would let pride drive them into the realm of gods. Theseus returned to the world above, but not unchanged. The descent into the underworld, the failure of the venture, the loss of his companion all weighed upon him. His boldness had brought him close to ruin, and though he was freed, a shadow clung to his name, the burden of friendship and recklessness. The tales of Theseus and Pirithous stand apart from the earlier glories of his youth. They are darker, more complex, tinged with the overreach that so often marks the later careers of heroes. Where once Theseus had fought for his people, facing brigands and monsters, now he ventured into deeds that served personal pride more than public good. And yet, within these stories lies a deep humanity, for who has not, in friendship, been drawn into choices they might not have made alone? Who has not felt the pull of loyalty, binding them even to actions that reason would have avoided? Theseus, so strong in body, was not immune to the bonds of companionship. His loyalty to Pirithous, his desire to match his friend in daring, drew him into shadows he might otherwise have escaped. The Athenians, in retelling these stories, saw in them both caution and pathos. They honored Theseus as their founder, their hero, but they also remembered the cost of pride, the danger of reaching too far. In the figure of Pirithous, trapped forever in Hades, they saw the image of ambition unrestrained. In Theseus's return, the reminder that even heroes bear scars. As you let these tales drift in your mind, imagine the two companions as they were first seen, standing across from one another on the plain of Marathon, swords raised, then lowered in mutual respect. Picture them side by side at the wedding feast, fighting back the centaurs. See them conspiring to carry away Helen, bold and heedless of consequence. And finally, see them descending into the underworld, their friendship leading them into silence and shadow. It is a story of comradeship and of folly, of loyalty and of loss. A story that reminds us that even the greatest heroes are human, drawn by bonds of love and pride, capable of mistakes as well as triumphs. And in that humanity, their tales remain with us, not only as myth, but as reflections of the choices and ties that shape every life. When we think of heroes, we often picture them in the blaze of their triumphs. The young warrior lifting a sword, the conqueror of beasts, the founder of cities. Yet every life has shadows, and the arc of Theseus, like so many figures of Greek legend, did not end in glory. His later years were marked by decline, by estrangement, and by a slow unraveling of the authority he had once commanded with such ease. To tell these stories is not to diminish him, but to complete him, to see him not only as a myth, but as a man whose fate bent under the weight of time. The seeds of his decline were planted in earlier choices. His abduction of Helen and his disastrous venture into Hades with Pirithous had not passed without consequence. Though he had returned alive, the Athenians could not fail to notice the shift in his actions. Where once he had fought brigands and monsters for the good of the land, now he had risked their city in reckless exploits that bore no benefit to his people. The hero who had once stood as a unifier and protector began to appear as one who sought only his own renown. Athens itself was changing. The city Theseus had helped to unify was growing in strength, wealth, and ambition. But with growth came restlessness, and voices arose questioning whether one man should wield such power. Theseus had established laws, but even laws can be turned against the hand that crafted them. The same people who once celebrated him began to murmur, asking whether his place as king was still justified. The shadow of discontent accounts of this period differ, as myths often do. Some say Theseus lost the favor of the people because of his absence during the ill-fated adventure with Pirithous. While he wandered into the underworld, Athens was left leaderless, exposed to rivalries and instability. Others suggest that his harshness in judgment, his stern enforcement of order, bred resentment among those who longed for gentler governance. Still others claim that his political innovations, especially the unification of Attica under Athenian rule, planted seeds of discord among noble families who resented the loss of their independence. Whatever the cause, the air around him grew heavy with opposition. When he had been young, his strength and courage silenced dissent. But in middle age, those same qualities seemed less dazzling, less effective in holding back the tide of discontent. Theseus, proud and accustomed to reverence, must have felt the shift like a stone pressing upon his chest. For years, he had been the figure around whom Athens revolved. Now, his grip was loosening, and the city he had shaped began to move beyond him. The rise of Mnestheus, the discontent of the people, found a figurehead in Mnestheus, a descendant of Erechtheus, one of Athens's ancient kings. Mnestheus was skilled in words, a politician more than a warrior, and he spoke to the grievances of the nobles who had lost power under Theseus's reforms. Where Theseus's authority had been built upon strength and action, Mnestheus's influence grew through persuasion and intrigue. Slowly, the allegiance of Athens shifted. Mnestheus whispered that Theseus's time had passed, that the city needed a leader who could guide it with diplomacy rather than reckless deeds. The nobles listened. The common people listened. And the tide that once bore Theseus aloft began to pull against him. Exile and wandering at last, the tension came to a breaking point. Some say Theseus was formally deposed, others that he left of his own accord, sensing the growing hostility. In either case, he departed Athens, the city he had unified, the throne he had defended, the people he had once served so fiercely. His exile carried him first to the island of Skyros, ruled by King Lycomedes. The reasons for this journey are uncertain. Some suggest he sought refuge, hoping for hospitality in his declining years. Others say he still nurtured ambitions, intending to muster support there for a return to Athens. Still others claim he had kinship ties to the island, making it a natural place to retreat. But Skyros would not prove a safe haven. The death of a hero, the end of Theseus, is shrouded in shadows. In one telling, Lycomedes, fearing that Theseus might challenge his authority or bring strife to his island, lured him to a high cliff under the pretense of showing him fertile land. There, he pushed him from the heights, and Theseus fell to his death upon the rocks below. In another version, the death was no act of treachery, but of accident. Theseus, walking alone along the cliffs, slipped upon the stones and fell, his life ending not in battle, not in grandeur, but in the quiet cruelty of chance. Whichever story one accepts, the result is the same. The great hero, once the pride of Athens, perished far from the city he had served in obscurity. His body left upon foreign soil, memory and return, yet death did not erase his presence. Years later, when Athens faced difficulty, the oracle at Delphi declared that the bones of Theseus must be returned to the city. It was Cimon, the Athenian statesman and general, who fulfilled this command, bringing the remains of the hero back to Athens with honor. There, Theseus was enshrined not only as a king of the past, but as a protector of the people. His memory became a rallying point, his name invoked in times of need. Though his end had been tragic, his legacy was woven back into the life of the city, polished by the passage of time until the flaws and failures faded. and the glory remained. Reflection on decline. There is a certain gentleness in pausing here at the twilight of the tale. To see Theseus not only in triumph but also in decline is to understand him more fully. For no life is constant victory, and even the strongest grow old, even the greatest falter. Theseus's story is not only about monsters slain and cities founded. It is about the passage of time, the shifting of fortunes, the fragility of reputation. In his exile, in his fall upon the rocks, we glimpse the humanity that underlies the myth. He was not only a hero carved in marble, but a man of flesh and blood, subject to the same turns of fate that guide every life. And yet, even in decline, his presence lingered. Athens could not forget him. The unifier, the lawgiver, the slayer of the Minotaur, these images endured, outshining the shadows of his later years. In this way, Theseus reminds us that legacy is not a single moment, not a final fall or final triumph, but the sum of a life, remembered and retold across generations. As you let this part of the story settle, imagine Theseus upon the cliffs of Skyros, gazing out across the sea. The waves roll endlessly beneath him, the same sea he once crossed on his way to Crete, the same sea upon which his father cast himself in sorrow. The wind carries the salt of memory, and in his heart, perhaps, he feels both pride and weariness. He has lived boldly, sometimes wisely, sometimes recklessly, but always fully. And now the sea waits to receive him, as it has received so many before, in the hush of that image. His story does not end in despair, but in acceptance, the calm recognition that every hero must one day step aside, leaving the stage to those who follow. When the stones of Skyros closed over the body of Theseus, it might have seemed that the story had ended. A king deposed, a hero fallen, a man whose final days were marked not by triumph, but by obscurity and exile. And yet, for the Greeks, death was not the end of a hero's tale. In many ways, it was only the beginning of their transformation into legend. For Theseus, as with Heracles before him, the mortal life gave way to something larger, a life woven into the memory of a city, preserved in ritual, enshrined in story. In the years after his fall, Athens turned its gaze back upon the man who had once ruled them. Time has a way of softening the edges of memory, the quarrels that had driven him into exile, the criticisms that had eroded his power, grew faint in the telling. What endured were the deeds that had defined him, the unification of Attica, the slaying of the Minotaur, the reforms that bound Athens together. The man who had died far from home was reborn as a figure of civic pride. The oracles command. The transformation of Theseus's legacy began with an oracle. During the Persian Wars, when Athens faced threats that could unmake the city itself, the people sought guidance from Delphi. The oracle declared that if Athens was to prosper, they must recover the bones of Theseus and bring them back to their city. The command was more than a religious instruction. It was a symbol. To bring home the remains of Theseus was to reclaim their founder, to anchor the city in the memory of the man who had once united its scattered tribes. It was an act of remembrance and renewal, a way of binding past to present, of invoking the hero's protection in times of crisis. It was Cimon, the Athenian general and statesman of the 5th century BCE, who fulfilled this charge. He sailed to Skyros, where Theseus had died. and searched for the hero's resting place. According to tradition, a great skeleton was found, one of unusual size, fitting for a figure of legend. With solemnity, the bones were carried back across the sea to Athens, a reverse echo of the voyage Theseus had once made to Crete, the Theseanupon, his return. The Athenians built a sanctuary in his honor, known as the Thesean. This was not merely a tomb, but a place of worship, a shrine where the people could gather to honor the hero who had become their protector in death as he had been in life. The Thesean became a focal point of civic identity, a reminder that Athens was not only a city of mortals, but a city guarded by heroes within its walls. Sacrifices were made, festivals celebrated. Theseus became, in essence, a patron saint of the city, invoked in prayers and honored in ceremonies. The cult of Theseus bound his memory to the fabric of Athenian life. He was not just a story told at feasts or in poems, but a presence woven into the very rituals of the people. Hero cults and Memorian Greek tradition, the worship of heroes was a bridge between the divine and the mortal. Unlike gods, who lived in the eternal realm of Olympus, heroes were once human, their lives rooted in the soil of the earth. To honor a hero was to honor the shared heritage of humanity and divinity, the liminal space where greatness could touch the everyday. Theseus's cult reflected this duality. He was remembered as both king and hero, lawgiver and adventurer. To the Athenians, he embodied the virtues they prized: courage, cunning, devotion to the city. Yet he also embodied the cautionary tale, the dangers of pride, the risks of recklessness, the inevitability of decline. His cult did not erase his flaws, but rather absorbed them, transforming them into lessons for the living. Festivals in his honor emphasized unity and shared identity. Just as Theseus had once brought the scattered villages of Attica into one polis, his cult served to remind Athenians of their collective bond. To celebrate Theseus was to celebrate Athens itself, to reaffirm the city as a community united under common laws and shared myths. Theseus in art and story. The memory of Theseus spread beyond ritual into the arts. Pottery from the classical period depicts him in moments of triumph wrestling the Minotaur, battling the bandits of the road, carrying out labors that echoed those of Heracles. In sculpture and painting, he appeared as the quintessential Athenian hero, youthful, strong, poised between humanity and divinity. Playwrights wove him into their dramas. In Euripides' Supplicant Women, Theseus appears as a just and noble king, a defender of the weak, a voice of reason amid chaos. In other plays, his presence is invoked as a symbol of Athenian virtue. The stage became another sanctuary where his memory was kept alive, not as history, but as moral example. Even historians, such as Plutarch, writing centuries later, found in Theseus a figure worth study. In his parallel lives, Plutarch paired Theseus with the Roman hero Romulus, comparing their roles as founders of cities. Through such writings, Theseus's image traveled beyond Athens, becoming part of a broader conversation about what it meant to lead, to rule, to build civilization. Myth, as near as Athens grew into an empire during the classical age, Theseus's story grew with it. He became more than a hero of the past. He became a mirror for the ambitions of the present. His voyage to Crete was remembered as a symbol of Athens's defiance of tyranny. His unification of Attica was celebrated as the model of civic harmony. Even his flaws, his rashness, his arrogance were recast as reminders that power must be tempered by wisdom. In this way, the Athenians shaped Theseus as they needed him. He was their idealized ancestor, the proof that their city had always been destined for greatness. His cult was less about who he had been in life and more about who Athens wished to see in its reflection. The afterlife of a hero Theseus's influence did not end with classical Athens. In the centuries that followed, his story was retold in countless variations. Roman poets adopted him, reshaping his adventures to suit their own cultural ideals. Later still, in the Renaissance, his figure re-emerged in literature and art, a symbol of chivalry and noble action. But through all these one thread remained constant: the sense that Theseus was not merely a man of his time, but a figure of enduring relevance. His life, with its triumphs and its tragedies, offered lessons about courage, leadership, and the fragile balance between greatness and downfall. Reflection on legacy too. Linger on Theseus's legacy is to see the way myth softens and reshapes reality. The man who died in exile, rejected by his people, became in memory a guardian of the very city that had turned against him. The fractures of his reign were smoothed into symbols of unity. The recklessness of his youth became stories of daring. The sorrows of his decline faded before the brightness of his earlier deeds. This is the nature of legacy. It is not a record kept in perfect accuracy, but a story retold, reshaped to inspire, to comfort, to bind communities together. In honoring Theseus, the Athenians honored themselves. His myth was their myth, his victories their victories, his memory their inheritance, and so his presence lingered, not in the flesh but in stone sanctuaries, painted vases, whispered prayers, and the hearts of those who saw in him the image of what Athens could be. Closing commas, you rest with this story. Picture the Thessian in Athens on a quiet evening. The sun is low, casting long shadows across its columns. Within, the air is cool, carrying the faint scent of incense. A handful of worshippers place offerings upon the altar-bread wine, a garland of fresh leaves. They whisper his name not as a king long dead, but as a hero still present, a protector watching over the city. Outside, the streets of Athens hum with life, the city continuing, growing, changing. But within the sanctuary, time seems to pause. The bones of Theseus lie beneath the stones, and above them his story lives, a thread woven into the fabric of the city's identity. The boy who once ran along the shores of Troezen, the youth who lifted the stone to claim his father's sword, the man who walked the twisting passages of the labyrinthal of these cells, have folded into memory, and in that memory he has become more than mortal. He has become the spirit of a people, the echo of a city's soul. In this quiet, the story of Theseus does not end in exile, nor in a fall upon the rocks of Skyros. It ends here, in remembrance, in the calm endurance of myth. He belongs not to the cliffs of a distant island, but to Athens, to the hearts of those who call it home, and to all who listen, even now, across the centuries. And so, as the tale draws to its close, let us leave Theseus where he rests in the gentle hush of memory, in the slow breath of myth, in the enduring calm of stories told to ease us into sleep.